Section 1. The surface where the iceberg begins. There is something uniquely satisfying about a show that has been running for over 25 years and still has things inside it that you have never noticed. Most shows, even long-running ones, give up most of their secrets within a few attentive viewings. You figure out the formula, you understand the characters, you clock the recurring jokes, and the mystery dissolves. But Family Guy is a different kind of animal. On the surface, it looks straightforward enough, a dysfunctional animated family in a fictional Rhode Island town, cycling through absurd adventures, getting into trouble, generating cutaway gags and catchphrases, and usually resetting back to baseline by the time the credits roll. You have watched it. You might have watched all of it. You have probably seen many episodes more than once. And if someone asked you to describe the show, you could do it in a sentence or two without straining. But here is what that surface-level description misses. Underneath 25 years of episodes, underneath hundreds of cutaway gags and dozens of canceled plot lines and an enormous volume of creative decisions, both intentional and accidental, there is an iceberg. And the iceberg goes so much deeper than the part you can see from above the water that by the time we reach the bottom of it today, the show you thought you understood will look genuinely different. What we are going to do here is go deep in a systematic way. We are going to start at the surface, the things most viewers already know, or the things that are easy to find if you look, and we are going to descend through progressively stranger and more obscure territory. The lore, the hidden details, the production history, the fan theories, the philosophical implications of things the writers put into the world without apparently realizing what they were putting there, the connections between the show and real events, the questions the show has been asking for 25 years without answering, and the theories at the very bottom of the iceberg, the ones that require you to set aside everything the show tells you it is and ask what it might actually be, underneath all the laughter. Before we go anywhere, drop a comment right now. Tell me the time and the place you are watching from. It does not matter if it is 3 in the morning in your bedroom or your lunch break or a lazy weekend afternoon wherever you are. Whatever time it is, I want to know. This community has people watching from all over the world at all hours, and it never gets less interesting to see. And if this kind of deep dive content is something you enjoy, subscribe before you forget, because it really does make a difference to what we are able to make. Now let us begin. The surface of any iceberg, before you start asking questions about what is underneath it, has to be understood clearly. You need to know exactly what is visible and what most people already know before you start going down. So let us do that properly, starting with the facts of the show's creation and early history, that are documented but that contain more interesting detail than the shorthand version usually captures. Family Guy was created by Seth Woodbury MacFarlane, born October 26, 1973, in Kent, Connecticut. By the age of 2, he was already drawing cartoon characters. By 9, he was publishing a weekly comic strip in a local newspaper for $5 a week. He studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design, where he made connections that would directly influence the show's eventual setting. The fictional town in Rhode Island owes its existence in part to MacFarlane's classmates, and the geography he absorbed during those years. After graduating, he was recruited to Hollywood as an animator and writer for Hanna-Barbera Productions, where he worked on Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. This is important context for understanding what he brought to Family Guy, because the comedic DNA of those Hanna-Barbera shows the exaggerated characters, the willingness to be weird. The physical gag sensibility is audible in the early seasons of Family Guy, if you know where to listen for it. During his time at Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane created 2 short animated films called The Life of Larry and Steve. If you go back and watch these shorts, which were produced between 1995 and 1997, what you are watching is the direct creative prototype for Family Guy. Larry is clearly the precursor to Peter Griffin, an overweight, not particularly bright man with a wide-eyed relationship with the world. Steve is clearly the precursor to Brian, a talking dog with opinions, dry humor, and a more sophisticated inner life than the world around him gives him credit for. MacFarlane took those 2 characters, redesigned and renamed them, built a family around them, and pitched the result as a 15-minute pilot to Fox in May of 1998. Fox, who had initially expected something more modest, saw the pilot and ordered the show to series. Family Guy premiered on January 31, 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33. That Super Bowl placement is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it is the single luckiest break the show ever received. The Super Bowl is the most watched television event of any given year in America, often drawing over 90 million viewers. The network that airs the Super Bowl has the most watched post-game time slot in television, almost guaranteed to expose whatever airs in it to the largest possible audience. Family Guy's first episode pulled in approximately 22 million viewers. That is not a realistic picture of the show's actual audience. Most of those 22 million people were still watching because they had not yet changed the channel from the game. But it set a benchmark, generated enormous word of mouth, and gave the show the kind of initial momentum that many better shows never receive. What happened next is one of television history's most documented scheduling disasters. Fox moved Family Guy around the schedule with a frequency that would have killed any show. During its second season, it was placed on Thursday nights at 9, directly against Frasier on NBC, which was at the time one of the highest-rated comedies on television, a show with an established, devoted audience that had been watching for years. The ratings for Family Guy dropped significantly. Fox then moved it to Tuesday nights, where it competed against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, which was at the peak of its game show popularity. More ratings damage. Fox kept shuffling the show to different days and different time slots with insufficient notice to allow the audience to track it. And by the end of the third season, in 2002, Fox canceled the show. This was widely reported at the time as a reasonable response to declining ratings, and the show seemed finished. The resurrection story is well known in broad outline, but contains some specifics that deserve attention. Cartoon Network acquired the syndication rights to Family Guy, reruns for what was by any financial measure a bargain price, because at the point of sale, nobody in the industry believed the show had significant residual value. They placed it in the Adult Swim late-night programming block, starting on April 20th, 2003. The response was remarkable. Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block, outperforming not just other Adult Swim shows, but competing cable programming across the board. The show boosted Adult Swim's total viewership by 239%. At the same time, DVD sets of the first and second seasons hit retail and sold over 400,000 copies, a genuine commercial success for a canceled cartoon that the industry had written off. Fox noticed. By 2004, they had decided to order new episodes, and the fourth season premiered on May 1st, 2005. This represented something genuinely unprecedented in American television. A show that had been canceled not once but twice, being revived to a larger audience than it had before its second cancellation. Fans celebrated, and the return of Family Guy was treated as one of the significant pop culture events of that year. Now here is where the first, genuinely interesting question at the surface level arises, and it is one that most casual discussions of the show's history skip past. The show that came back in 2005 was not the same show that was canceled in 2002. Not meaningfully, not in the ways that mattered. The gap between the end of Season 3 and the beginning of Season 4 was not just a gap in broadcast. It was a gap in personnel, in creative continuity, and in the institutional knowledge that makes a show feel coherent across multiple seasons. When a show is canceled, the writers move on to other projects. They take other jobs, develop other material, build other creative relationships. You cannot expect a group of creative professionals to hold themselves in suspension for 3 years, on the off chance that a canceled show might return. MacFarlane himself acknowledged this directly, noting that one of the most damaging effects of the show constantly being yanked off the air was that they were perpetually having to bring in new writers and rebuild the creative room from scratch. The original writing team that produced the first 3 seasons included names like Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These writers, working under MacFarlane's close creative supervision, established the show's tone, its humor, its character dynamics, and the specific sensibility that made it feel like something nobody had seen before. By the time the show returned for Season 4, most of that team had scattered. New writers were brought in. Different sensibilities entered the room. And while individual new writers might be extraordinarily talented, many of them clearly were the collective intelligence that had produced the early seasons, was not the same collective intelligence that would produce the revival. This is the foundational fact that everything else in today's discussion rests on. So it is worth sitting with for a moment before we descend further. Family Guy has two distinct creative eras separated by a 3-year gap. Everything that follows, every character transformation, every tonal shift, every fan theory about why things changed, every question about what the show was really doing traces back to that gap. The Iceberg is, in many ways, an iceberg about a gap. The voice cast, at the surface level, includes a set of facts that most viewers know but that contain interesting texture if you look closely. Seth MacFarlane voices 4 of the show's primary characters: Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, a feat of vocal range that requires both technical skill and enormous stamina. Given that all 4 voices appear in most episodes, and recording sessions can run for hours, MacFarlane has described the physical demands of this work candidly, including the network's tendency to try to put him in the recording booth when he was clearly unwell, which he consistently pushed back against. The casting of Meg is one of the show's most interesting behind-the-scenes stories. Lacey Chabert, who was already established as a voice actress through her work on The Wild Thornberrys, voiced Meg in the first season. Her departure after season 1 was contractual rather than the result of any creative dissatisfaction. She and the production could not come to agreement on the terms of a full series commitment. Mila Kunis, who was at the time best known for that 70s show, took over the role starting in the second season. If you listen carefully to the difference between Chabert's Meg and Kunis's version, there is a genuinely interesting contrast. Chabert's Meg has an earnest, slightly desperate vocal quality. She sounds like someone trying hard to be heard. Kunis's Meg settles into a more resigned, slightly flat effect that, in later seasons, becomes the characteristic quality of the voice. The sound of someone who has stopped expecting to be heard and has learned to speak anyway out of habit. The origin of Chris Griffin's voice is the best single piece of behind-the-scenes casting trivia in the show's history. Seth Green, already an established performer, went into his audition in an experimental mood. A friend had dared him, just before the session, to do his impression of Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, Anthony Hopkins' iconic psychological thriller from 1991. Green did the impression in the room. The casting team responded enthusiastically. Chris Griffin's vocal DNA, that slow, slightly bewildered, oddly sincere delivery with its particular rhythmic strangeness, descends directly from a dare involving one of cinema's most disturbing villains. The writers were aware of this connection, which is why there is an episode where Chris recreates Buffalo Bill's infamous mirror dance scene from the film in front of a camcorder, and why the episode presents this as something that feels natural for Chris's character to do. The show is acknowledging its own casting mythology. The show's opening theme, with Peter and Lois at the piano while the family gathers around, is not original. It is a deliberate homage to the opening of All in the Family, the Norman Lear sitcom that ran on CBS from 1971 to 1979, where Archie and Edith Bunker sit at an upright piano and sing about the good old days while the world changed around them. MacFarlane has said openly that he considers Lear one of the masters of the form. He was attempting to work in a comedy that used the safe frame of a family sitcom to engage with genuinely controversial social material, that trusted its audience to understand the difference between what a character believes and what the show endorses. The Lear connection goes deeper than the opening title. It shapes the fundamental project of what Family Guy was trying to do in its early seasons: use the ridiculousness of its family as a vehicle for saying things that a more sober show could not get away with saying. The tragedy of the show's later years, from this perspective, is not just that it got meaner, it is that it stopped trying to say anything. Now we go down. Section 2. The common theories, what the fandom has been arguing about for years. Every long-running show with a devoted fan base eventually generates a body of theory that lives in parallel to the show itself. Fan communities create elaborate frameworks for understanding the gaps and inconsistencies in the text, for reading significance into moments the creators intended as throwaway jokes, for proposing explanations that are more interesting than the mundane reality of rushed production schedules and inconsistent writing rooms. Family Guy, with its enormous cast, its deliberate disregard for continuity, its tendency to accidentally generate implications it never intended to follow through on, and its 25-year run of ever-shifting creative control, has generated one of the most extensive bodies of fan theory of any animated comedy. The theories at this level of the iceberg are the ones the fandom has been discussing for years. the ones that appear in the most viewed YouTube videos, the most shared Reddit threads, the most cited fan wikis. But even the familiar theories have unexplored dimensions, and before we descend to stranger territory, it is worth laying out the canonical fan theory landscape as carefully as possible. The purgatory theory is the one that appears in every Family Guy fan theory compilation, and it persists across so many different formulations because it is genuinely one of the most coherent explanatory frameworks for the show's internal contradictions. The core argument is this: the Griffin family and their neighbors are dead, and the events of the show are taking place in some form of afterlife, most commonly described as purgatory, a transitional state where souls work through the fundamental problems that defined their earthly lives before they can move on. The specific character of each person's purgatorial experience is determined by the nature of the sin or limitation they are being asked to confront and transcend. Consider the applications. Peter Griffin, in life, was a man who never grew up, who prioritized his own immediate gratification over the needs of the people who depended on him, who found adult responsibility genuinely beyond his capabilities, who wanted to be a child even as he occupied the body and the social role of an adult. His purgatory is exactly what you would design if you wanted to force someone with those traits to face what they had been avoiding. He is a husband and a father. He is surrounded by people who need him to be present, capable, and emotionally available. He is constitutionally incapable of providing what they need, and the result is that he fails over and over, in increasingly painful ways, in front of an audience of millions. The purgatory is not subtle. He is being asked to learn what he never learned in life, and every episode is another iteration of that lesson being presented to someone who does not yet have the capacity to receive it. Lois is a woman of privilege, the Pewterschmidt heir, accustomed to wealth and social standing, and the particular freedom that comes from never having to worry about money, who in her purgatory is stripped of everything her privilege provided. She is married to a working-class man of limited intelligence and even more limited income. She lives in a modest house in a modest neighborhood. She has no career, no independent income, and very little of the social recognition that the version of her who grew up in the Pewterschmidt mansion would have had automatic access to. The theory frames this as precisely calibrated punishment for a woman who, in life, may have used her privilege as an excuse not to develop the qualities that might have made her genuinely good: empathy, patience, the ability to love people who did not reflect her status back at her. Her purgatory is requiring her to love and care for people who offer nothing she was accustomed to receiving, in circumstances that strip away every external marker of her value. Brian is perhaps the most elegantly constructed purgatorial case in the theory. A man of genuine intelligence, literary aspiration, and sophisticated taste, who in life perhaps allowed those qualities to become the basis of an arrogance that prevented real connection, finds himself in death inhabiting the body of a dog. He can think, he can speak, he can read and appreciate literature and argue philosophy and fall in love with human women. Everything is present except the vessel. The world looks at him and sees a pet, not a person, and this gap between how he perceives himself and how he is perceived is the core of his suffering. His purgatorial task is to learn humility, to love and be loved without the armor of being taken seriously, to find value in genuine connection rather than in the recognition of his intelligence. And in his best moments, in the early seasons, you can see him making progress on exactly that task. Stewie's application of the theory is the most philosophically complex and also the most emotionally resonant when you sit with it. Here is a being of extraordinary capability, a genius, a builder, an inventor, a planner who has been placed in the most helpless and powerless form imaginable, a 1-year-old infant. Everything he can do in his mind, he cannot do in the world. He designs weapons that his hands can barely hold. He hatches plans that the world does not take seriously because the world cannot hear him. His purgatorial irony is perfect, the greatest possible gap between capability and power. The theory suggests that in life, Stewie was someone who used capability as a substitute for love, who pursued dominion and mastery because genuine vulnerability was too frightening. His purgatory forces him into total vulnerability while preserving his awareness of what he has lost. He can see exactly what he is unable to be. The evolution of Stewie across the show's seasons is, within the purgatory framework, the show's most encouraging narrative. The evil baby who plotted world domination in Season 1 has, by the later seasons, become someone capable of genuine friendship, genuine sacrifice, genuine care. He used his time machine to save Brian's life at enormous personal risk. He has expressed emotional truths that the early Stewie would have found beneath contempt. If the purgatory theory is correct, Stewie has been making progress. He is learning what he needed to learn. And the arc of his development from villainy to humanity is not a creative mistake or a failure of nerve by the writers. It is the story of a soul in purgatory moving toward redemption. Meg, in the purgatory theory, most commonly appears as someone who in life was cruel to others, a bully. Someone who made people feel small, who used social cruelty as currency. Her purgatory is to receive exactly what she once dispensed. She is the target. She is the person everyone finds it acceptable to mock, dismiss, and harm. The theory, in its cruelest version, suggests that the escalation of abuse toward Meg across the seasons reflects the scale of what she did in her earthly life, that she was worse than we might assume, and her purgatory is correspondingly severe. In a more merciful version, it suggests that Meg has actually been making progress, that the woman who in the later seasons learns to fight back, to claim her own value, to demand basic dignity, is approaching the lesson she needed to learn. Her arc in this reading is not a series of arbitrary cruelties. It is a redemption story told from the bottom. The contaminated water theory is at a different philosophical register than the purgatory theory. It offers a mundane, materialist explanation for the same set of phenomena rather than a supernatural one. The theory originates in a brief establishment in Season 5 that the town's lake is heavily polluted with industrial waste. The theory proposes that this contamination has been leaching into the municipal water supply for years, and that the behavioral changes visible across the cast, across multiple seasons, are the result of chronic low-level neurotoxic exposure. This is actually a well-documented real-world phenomenon, the most famous example being the correlation between lead exposure and behavioral problems in American cities throughout the latter half of the 20th century. And Family Guy's world, with its heavy industrial presence and its famously unconcerned local government, would be exactly the kind of environment where this could happen. The behavioral changes the theory needs to explain are substantial. Peter goes from a lovable if reckless father to someone whose impulsivity and capacity for harm escalate steadily. Lois goes from warm patience to cold detachment. Brian goes from grounded intelligence to grandiose pretension. Quagmire becomes, if anything, more unhinged, rather than less. Joe becomes increasingly volatile. These changes track, at least loosely, with what you would expect from the progressive effects of neurotoxic exposure on different personality types. And the theory has a neat explanatory addition for the show's famous cutaway structure. The random, disconnected, apparently hallucinatory nature of the cutaways is not a narrative device. It is a symptom. The characters are experiencing chemically induced cognitive disruptions, and the cutaways are the show rendering those disruptions from the inside. The theory that Stewie perceives the entire show explains the format in a fundamentally different way. Articulated most coherently by the Reddit user iFornication, this theory proposes that Family Guy is best understood as the world filtered through the perceptual and cognitive architecture of a one-year-old infant. Not Stewie's internal monologue, not Stewie's imagination, Stewie's actual perception, the unfiltered experience of an infant trying to make sense of a world whose logic is mostly opaque to him. From this perspective, everything strange about the show is actually accurate. An infant's father is not simply large. He is overwhelming, incomprehensible in scale, a force of nature as much as a person. Peter's enormous size, his volatility, his inconsistency from episode to episode, his tendency to be both terrifying and loving in rapid succession. This is precisely what a father looks like to a child who is still developing the cognitive architecture to understand what a father is. Lois, from Stewie's perspective, is all-encompassing, the source of food, warmth, comfort, and constraint, whose presence fills the whole world when she is present, and whose absence is genuinely alarming. Brian talks because Stewie loves Brian and projects full personhood onto him, as infants do with beloved animals. The other characters exist in Stewie's perception as vivid, but incompletely rendered figures, their inner lives inaccessible, their behaviors confusing, their motivations mysterious. The cutaways, in this theory, are not simply random humor. They are the way an infant experiences time and causality. Adults perceive the world as a coherent narrative, with discernible cause and effect. Infants do not. The world is a series of vivid impressions, with no clear connective tissue between them. You are in the kitchen, and then you are somewhere completely different, and the transition between the two was not registered as meaningful. The show's non sequitur structure is the accurate phenomenology of infant consciousness. The pre-cancellation parallel universe theory is perhaps the most formally elegant of the common theories, because it uses the show's own established physics to explain the show's most widely noted quality discontinuity. The multiverse is real within the show's universe. It has been canonically established, characters have traveled through it, and the show has explicitly demonstrated that multiple versions of the Griffin family exist in different realities. The theory proposes that the Family Guy we watched from 1999 to 2002, the warm and character-driven show of the early seasons, and the Family Guy we have watched from 2005 onward, are not the same show. Not just because different writers are making different creative choices. Literally. The family we have been following since the revival is a parallel universe version of the family we originally watched, close enough to recognize, different enough that attentive viewers have been sensing the wrongness for 20 years without being able to put their finger exactly on what it is. The evidence that Brian and Stewie did not travel back in time, in Back to the Pilot, that they crossed into a different universe, is embedded in how the episode plays. The earlier Brian is perceptibly different in his warmth and groundedness. The earlier Stewie is more openly menacing. The show that the earlier versions of these characters inhabit has a different quality, a different atmosphere, a different emotional temperature. The theory is that this difference is not just the visual and tonal result of animating the early episodes differently from the revival episodes. It is the show acknowledging, with the multiverse as its mechanism, that these are genuinely different realities. The original Griffin family is still out there, in their warmer world, living their better lives. What we have been watching for the past 20 years is a parallel version. Section 3. Mid-tier mysteries, character backstories, and the hidden lore beneath the surface. When you descend to the mid-tier of the Family Guy iceberg, you are entering territory that requires not just casual familiarity with the show, but genuine attentive viewing across its full run. The pieces of information in this section were placed in the show in scattered fragments across different seasons, sometimes years apart, and they only form a coherent picture when you gather them together. These are the details that dedicated fans know, that appear in the obsessive fan wikis and the detailed episode guides, but that most viewers have either missed entirely or encountered without recognizing their full significance. Glenn Quagmire first. Because Quagmire is simultaneously the simplest and the most deceptive character in the show. His surface-level characterization is so consistent that it is easy to mistake simplicity for completeness. He is the sexually aggressive neighbor. He says his catchphrases. He is reliably funny in specific ways. And underneath that very reliable comedic persona is a character with more genuine depth than the show has ever chosen to excavate. The age question is where it starts. In the episode Foxy Lady, Quagmire's driver's license is briefly visible on screen. It states his age as 61. The show has never resolved the obvious question. This raises Quagmire looks approximately the same age as Peter, Joe, and Cleveland, who are all depicted as being in their late 30s to early 40s. His canonical explanation for this discrepancy, offered in a throwaway line, is that he eats carrots every day and this keeps him looking young. The show intends this as a joke. But 61 is a very specific number to put on a driver's license, and if you decide to take it seriously rather than dismissing it, it transforms the character. If Quagmire is genuinely 61 during the show's present, that means he was born around 1938, which means he was a young man in the 1950s and came of age during one of the most specific and consequential cultural moments in American history for the formation of male sexuality and social behavior. The Rat Pack. Hugh Hefner. The cocktail culture. The very particular understanding of masculinity that emerged from mid-century American entertainment, confident, performatively urbane, sexually voracious, and largely indifferent to the inner lives of women. Quagmire did not develop his personality in a vacuum. He developed it in a culture that told men exactly who he is. And he has never updated his internal model because, from his perspective, in his lived experience, the model worked. This is a genuinely more interesting character than the simple comedy predator. The show mostly presents him as. He is not a young man who has failed to grow up. He is a genuinely old man, older than anyone around him realizes, who grew up in a culture that no longer exists. His loneliness, which surfaces occasionally in the show, most notably in the backstory about Cheryl Teagues, the woman he actually loved and lost, whose absence he has been filling with meaningless sexual encounters ever since, is the loneliness of someone who has outlived his own cultural moment. He is a man from another time, occupying the wrong decade, doing what he was taught to do in a world that has moved past it. Quagmire's real surname is Quagglechek. He is half Polish. The anglicization from Quagglechek to Quagmire suggests a family history of immigrant assimilation, of changing the name to fit better, to be taken more seriously, to carry less of the old country. This kind of name change was extremely common in mid-century America, particularly among Catholic immigrant families in the northeastern states, which is exactly where the show is set and exactly the demographic that would have been the peer group of a man who was young in the 1950s. The detail adds a biographical specificity to a character who is usually presented as existing purely for satirical purposes. And then there is the palm reading from Madame Claude, offered in passing, that Quagmire was Jack the Ripper in a past life. This is played as a joke and never mentioned again. But sit with it. Jack the Ripper, the Victorian-era serial killer who targeted women, whose crimes have never been definitively solved, who has become a kind of cultural archetype for predatory male violence, is presented as the previous incarnation of a character whose defining trait is predatory male behavior. The show is suggesting, with a single throwaway gag, that Quagmire's character is not a quirk or a personality flaw. It is a soul condition that has persisted across lifetimes. He was this in another life, and he is this again. Whether that reads as a condemnation or a tragedy depends on how much sympathy you are able to extend to someone whose behavior the show has never properly interrogated. Joe Swanson's introduction in the show's first season, the episode A Hero Sits Next Door, established him as one of the most compelling secondary characters in the cast, and the subsequent 20-plus seasons of his treatment is one of the clearest illustrations of the show's deterioration. Joe in Season 1 is someone Peter is jealous of. Not resentfully jealous, not bitterly jealous, but the kind of genuinely impressed jealousy that a person feels when they encounter someone who is better than them and knows it. Joe is physically imposing, professionally accomplished, respected by the community, and possessed of a quality of character that the men at the Drunken Clam aspire to. His wheelchair is not a joke. It is a detail in the biography of a man who is clearly more capable than most people walking on two legs. The circumstances of how Joe became paraplegic have been explained multiple times over the show's run in ways that are mutually contradictory. The show has never committed to a single canonical version of the origin story. In different episodes, different elements of Joe's backstory appear and disappear. This inconsistency, which the show has never addressed or explained, has generated real fan discussion about which version of events is real within the show's universe and why the others differ. The Patrick Warburton theory that Joe Swanson and the Tick are the same person is one of those fan theories that the show has never confirmed or denied. But that becomes increasingly compelling the more carefully you examine both characters. Patrick Warburton voiced Joe, and also starred as the Tick in Fox's 2001 live-action adaptation of the superhero comic. Both characters have the same voice, obviously. But they also have the same physical profile, muscular, massive-chinned, dramatically inclined. The same vocal delivery style, large, declamatory, capable of shifting from bombastic confidence to earnest sincerity in a single breath. The same fundamental personality and overwhelming commitment to justice, combined with a specific kind of well-intentioned obliviousness. The fan theory proposes that Joe moonlights as the Tick, that his superhero identity is real, that the costume augments or unlocks physical capabilities that his injury would otherwise prevent, and that this explains the moments across the show where Joe demonstrates physical ability that seems genuinely inconsistent with a paraplegic man. The theory also gives Joe a motivation for his almost pathological commitment to crime fighting that goes beyond simple professional dedication. He has a superhero identity that he is maintaining in parallel with his ordinary life, and the wheelchair is not the full truth of his physical situation. It is the version of his situation that is safe to share with the neighbors. Meg's friend Neil Goldman is a character whose relationship to the show's production history has been hiding in plain sight. Neil Goldman is the name of an actual writer on the show, one of the original writers from the first 3 seasons. The character bearing his name in the show is a nervous, awkward young man with an unrequited obsession with Meg Griffin. He is the only character in the show's early seasons who treats Meg with genuine romantic interest, who sees her as someone worth pursuing rather than dismissing. Whether this represents the writer inserting himself as the character who appreciates the show's most undervalued character, a kind of sympathetic self-portrait, or something more complicated about the relationship between the writers and the characters they created is unclear. But it is unmistakably intentional, and it adds a layer of meta-commentary about who in the writer's room actually cared about Meg Griffin. Mayor Adam West, based on and explicitly named for the actor who played Batman in the 1966 television series, who voiced the character until his death in 2017, is presented across the show's run as magnificently and comprehensively insane. He is the comedic engine of a certain kind of non sequitur. He says whatever his strange private logic dictates. He applies municipal resources to bizarre personal projects. He makes pronouncements that have no apparent connection to the issues at hand. And the fan theory that his madness is a performance that Adam West is actually the most politically shrewd character in the show is more supported by his actions than his apparent randomness would suggest. The theory notes that West consistently survives situations that should be politically fatal. He consistently wins re-election despite behavior that would destroy any normal politician. He consistently gets what he wants, eventually, despite appearing to pursue his goals with complete disregard for standard institutional processes. The theory proposes that West has identified something true about how power works. That predictability is exploitable, but radical unpredictability makes you impossible to oppose. No one can mount an effective political campaign against a mayor whose next move cannot be anticipated, because even he does not seem to know what his next move will be. He has made his apparent insanity into an impenetrable defensive formation. The mayor who seems the most harmless is actually the most durable, because nobody takes him seriously enough to move against him strategically. Section 4. The Griffin family's dark secrets, what the show buried and never retrieved. This section descends into territory that requires holding several threads simultaneously. We are looking at the Griffin family as a unit rather than as individuals, and at the things the show has planted in their collective backstory that it subsequently tried to either ignore or explain away without ever really explaining. These are the buried things, the details that were placed in episodes as quick gags or backstory fragments that accumulated across years of viewing into something that feels like it has meaning even if the show never intended it to. The most persistently discussed piece of hidden Griffin family backstory is the question of whether Peter and Lois lost a child. In what the show presents as a throwaway joke in a specific episode, Peter makes a reference to having had a son who died. The show gets its quick dark laugh and moves immediately to the next beat. But fans have been returning to this moment for years, because if you decide to take it seriously, if you choose to treat it as a genuine revelation, rather than a dark comedy non sequitur, the emotional landscape of the entire show shifts. If there was a child who died, then the Griffin family is carrying a grief that is never directly addressed and never properly processed. Grief that goes underground does not disappear. It surfaces in other forms, finding expression in behavior that looks different from what it actually is. Peter's inability to be a serious and present father, the arrested development, the refusal of adult responsibility, the way he reverts to childishness in exactly the moments that most demand adult presence, could be the behavior of a man who experienced parenthood as catastrophic loss and has been unconsciously retreating from its full implications ever since. He can be silly, he can be fun, he can be present in the ways that a child would want a companion to be present. But the version of fatherhood that requires sustained emotional investment and genuine sacrifice, the version he was asked to provide and failed at, is the version that is associated with the worst thing that ever happened to him. Lois's characterization arc across the seasons, from warm, patient, genuinely engaged mother in the early years to increasingly cold, detached, and occasionally cruel figure in the later seasons, becomes, in this reading, something more than just a writing failure. It is the portrait of a woman whose emotional reserves were depleted by a loss she never fully grieved, and who has been compensating for that depletion by withdrawing further and further from the full emotional demands of the life she is living. The warmth in the early seasons is the warmth she was maintaining at effort. The coldness in the later seasons is what happens when the effort of maintaining becomes too much to sustain. The treatment of Meg, which in the later seasons escalates to a level of sustained cruelty that the show has never fully explained or justified, takes on a different quality in the light of the lost child theory. In the psychologically coherent version of this reading, Meg is the child the family decided, somewhere below the level of conscious awareness, not to invest in too heavily. If you have lost a child, the fear of losing another can express itself as a kind of preemptive withdrawal. You do not love this one too much, because loving too much is how you get destroyed. The cruelty toward Meg is not, and this is important, simply a case of Peter being a bad father and the show endorsing that badness. It is a portrait of a family enacting, through their treatment of their oldest daughter, the self-protective logic of people who have been hurt by loving too much and have decided not to make that mistake again. Peter's relationship with his own children has always been most honest about something the show has never wanted to say too directly: that Peter is afraid of his own kids. Not afraid in a physical sense, but afraid in the way that a child is afraid of things it does not understand. His own children are opaque to him. Their needs are mysterious. Their emotional lives are demanding. The early Peter, the one who meant well, who tried in his clumsy way to be present, who felt bad when he hurt people he loved, was afraid of this in a way that kept him honest. The later Peter, who has abandoned the effort, is protecting himself from the same fear by simply not engaging with it. The question of the Griffin children's biological parentage has occupied the fan community for years, and the evidence from the show itself is genuinely ambiguous in ways that suggest the question was at least partially considered by the writers, even if they never committed to a definitive answer. Stewie does not look like Peter's other children. Chris and Meg share certain physical characteristics with Lois. But the question of whose children they are, genetically, has been flagged multiple times in episodes, usually in ways that the show treats as jokes, but that leave a genuine ambiguity behind them. The fan theory that Stewie is the only child definitively Peter's, and that Chris and Meg are the children of other relationships, perhaps affairs of Lois's, from the period before or early in the marriage, would explain certain patterns in how Peter relates to each child differently. His treatment of Stewie, while often neglectful, occasionally reveals a quality of recognition that is absent in his dealings with his other children. Then, there is the Cleveland Jr. theory, which reaches outside the immediate Griffin family into the broader universe of the show. Cleveland Jr., who appeared in the early seasons of Family Guy as an active, energetic young child, was dramatically reimagined for the Cleveland show spin-off as overweight, slow-moving, and possessed of both a personality and a physical silhouette that fans immediately identified as resembling Peter Griffin far more than Cleveland himself. The suggestion, never confirmed by the show, played as a joke when it is addressed at all, is that Cleveland Jr. is Peter's biological son, the product of an affair between Peter and Cleveland's first wife Loretta, who also had a relationship with Quagmire. The physical resemblance, the personality similarities, and the established fact of Loretta's infidelity make this genuinely more plausible than the show has ever wanted to acknowledge. Lois's pre-marriage history is one of the most deliberately obscured parts of the show's lore, and the fragments that have been revealed across various episodes add up to a portrait of a woman considerably more interesting and considerably less comfortable than the patient suburban mother the show usually presents. She has been connected, in brief episode revelations, to a pornographic film made during her college years. She has relationships in her past with figures who operate in criminal or near-criminal spaces. Her reputation at her high school is such that the people who knew her then react to her present identity as a housewife, with what can only be described as knowing surprise. The Lois that Peter fell in love with was not the Lois we have been watching. She was someone with appetites and adventures, and a genuine history of choosing experience over safety. And the question of what happened to that person, what series of choices and losses turned her into the woman who makes breakfast and rolls her eyes at her husband, is never asked directly. But it is everywhere in the show if you know where to look. The Pewterschmidt family is the show's buried critique of inherited wealth, and it is a critique that the show has never been willing to make explicitly because Carter Pewterschmidt is too useful as a comic character. Carter is a billionaire who has, across multiple episodes, been shown or implied to have used his wealth in ways that would constitute serious harm and possibly criminal conduct if the show were in a genre that took those things seriously. He has manipulated politicians. He has damaged the environment. He has used his resources to insulate himself and his family from consequences that would destroy anyone without his level of wealth. The show treats all of this as characterization rather than as indictment, because to take Carter's behavior seriously would require taking seriously the question of what the Pewterschmidt wealth actually is, where it came from, what it cost, and what it continues to cost the people who live in its shadow. The contamination theory we discussed in the previous section connects here in a specific way. If the town's lake is polluted by industrial runoff, and if Carter Pewterschmidt has the kind of industrial presence in the town that his wealth suggests, then the contamination of the water supply could be Pewterschmidt's doing. The family's progressive behavioral deterioration across the seasons would then be Carter's fault. His daughter's coldness, his son-in-law's volatility, his grandchildren's various dysfunctions, all of it could trace back to a business decision his company made about waste disposal. The richest man in the show has poisoned his own family, and he sits in his mansion and treats their damage as a source of comedy. Section 5. Stewie's true nature, the deepest rabbit hole in the whole iceberg. Stewie Griffin is the character around whom the most interesting theories cluster, and the reason for that is ontological instability. He is the show's most internally contradictory figure. He exists in a state of permanent paradox that no other character quite matches. Simultaneously the show's most dangerous figure and its most helpless. Simultaneously, its most intelligent and its most ignorant of the world it inhabits. Simultaneously, the character with the most clearly defined inner life, and the one whose inner life the show has treated most erratically across its run. Understanding Stewie fully requires you to hold all of these contradictions at once, to resist the temptation to resolve them by prioritizing one reading over another, and to ask what a character who contains all of these contradictions simultaneously might actually be. Let us begin with the basics. In the show's first 3 seasons, Stewie is constructed around a single, overwhelming premise. He is an evil genius. Not a baby who is remarkably intelligent. Not a precocious child with sophisticated tastes. An evil genius, someone with a coherent and detailed program for world domination. The technical capability to pursue it, and the will to eliminate anyone who threatens it, including his own mother. The comedy of early Stewie depends entirely on the gap between this character and the vessel he inhabits. He is 1 year old. He is in diapers. He is carried around and cooed at and fed baby food. And he is doing all of this while internally orchestrating campaigns for global conquest. The contrast between the scale of his ambition and the helplessness of his physical form is the engine of all the humor. The weapons are worth dwelling on, because they are strange even within the show's logic. Stewie builds ray guns, mind control devices, weather-altering machines, and time machines in his bedroom. These objects are functional. They work when he uses them. They produce real consequences in the show's reality. But adults who observe them do not register what they are. Lois walks into Stewie's bedroom and sees mess. She sees a baby's room that needs tidying, not a weapons laboratory. Joe Swanson, a trained police officer, is in the Griffin household repeatedly across the show's run and never notices anything anomalous about the infant who lives there. This is sometimes explained as sloppy continuity or rule of comedy suspension of disbelief. But it is also genuinely strange in a way that suggests the show might be operating according to a logic it has never made explicit. Why can't adults see what Stewie is building? Is it that his devices are genuinely invisible to adult perception? Is the world doing something to protect itself from registering the full reality of what this baby represents? The most coherent answer the fan community has produced is that Stewie occupies a different layer of reality from the other characters, and that his devices exist in that layer. He is real, but not in the same way. His capabilities are real, but only within the scope of what reality will allow him to affect. He can build things. Those things work. But the part of reality that interfaces with adult human awareness is simply not the layer that Stewie's reality occupies. He can change the world in ways that only become visible to the right observer, and Brian, who can hear him and understand him and has always been the exception to the rule of adult obliviousness, is perhaps the right kind of observer. The question of what Stewie actually is not who he is within the narrative, but what he represents in a more fundamental sense, has been approached from multiple directions in the fan theory literature. The most elaborate version connects to the adult disguised as baby theory. This theory, developed from a Reddit post by a user named Jacob Wallace and expanded by subsequent commenters, starts from the canonical established fact that in the episode Inside Family Guy, the show presents itself as a television show being made by the Griffin family playing fictionalized versions of themselves. In other words, there is a meta layer in which the Griffins are actors, and the show is a construct, and the characters we watch are performances of characters who exist beneath the performance. In this meta layer, Stewie is not actually the youngest Griffin. He is the oldest. An adult who has chosen to play a baby in the family's show because, and this is where the theory gets genuinely interesting, it is safer. An adult who presents as a baby cannot be held accountable for adult behavior. An adult in a baby's body has access to a kind of social immunity. Nothing he does can be seriously prosecuted. Nothing he says can be seriously dismissed, because he is classified as not yet a person by the world around him. The genius of the baby performance is that it is the perfect cover for someone who wants to exist in a community without being fully subject to its rules. The evidence the theory cites includes the sophistication of Stewie's voice, more developed, more nuanced in its articulation than either of the older children, which would be explicable if Stewie is actually older than Chris and Meg rather than younger. It includes the physical capabilities Stewie demonstrates in combat scenes, which is inconsistent with actual infant physiology. And it includes the moments where Stewie seems to know things that only someone with more life experience could know, references to cultural material, emotional insights, responses to situations that suggest a longer history than a one-year-old should have. The time machine and its implications for Stewie's actual age and experience are the deepest part of this rabbit hole. If Stewie has been using his time machine across the full run of the show, and the show has established canonically that he uses it regularly and casually as a tool rather than reserving it for special occasions, then the question of how old Stewie actually is, in accumulated experience time, is not answerable from the show's surface chronology. He could have lived decades more than his body's 1 year suggests. He has met past versions of himself and future versions of himself. He has inhabited other realities. He has been to historical periods that existed before he was born and to futures that he has not yet reached. What this means, if you take it seriously, is that the Stewie we are watching in any given episode is not simply a 1-year-old baby. He is an entity whose experience timeline is enormously more complex than his apparent chronological age. He has memories and knowledge that predate his own birth and extend past his own life. He is, in a meaningful sense, not constrained by time in the way that every other character in the show is. And this makes his emotional choices, particularly his choice to remain with the Griffin family, to return to Spooner Street after all his adventures, to treat Brian as the most important thing in his existence, more significant rather than less. He is not staying because he has nowhere else to go. He is staying because, having been everywhere and every when, this is the place he has chosen. The Brian and Stewie episode from Season 8 deserves extended treatment here, because it is the single most honest thing the show has ever done with Stewie, and most discussions of it focus on Brian's revelation about the gun rather than on what Stewie reveals in the same episode. Locked in a bank vault overnight, forced by circumstances into conversation without distraction or escape, the two characters speak to each other in ways the show almost never permits. Brian reveals that he keeps a gun in his safety deposit box because there are days when he considers using it on himself, This is devastating and receives most of the critical attention the episode gets. But Stewie's response to Brian's confession, the way he absorbs it, the absence of judgment in how he receives it, the depth of care he expresses, tells us more about who Stewie actually is than most of the show's 2 decades of plot. He is not surprised. He understands despair in a way that the cheerful menace of his public persona would suggest he should not be capable of. And the love he expresses for Brian in that episode, the specificity of it, the way he names exactly what Brian means to him, and why is the love of someone who knows perfectly well that the world is difficult and painful, and that having a single genuine connection in it is not a small thing. It is the only thing. The Brian and Stewie episode also contains, as its final shot, a moment that the show has never followed up on, but that has generated enormous fan discussion. Stewie asks Brian to shoot him. Not as a threat, not as a game. He asks as what seems to be a genuine, if oblique, request for help with something he cannot articulate more directly. Brian does not do it. The episode ends there. The request is never explained, never returned to, never acknowledged in subsequent episodes. What did Stewie want Brian to do? The most interesting reading is that Stewie, knowing what he knows about time and reality, and the possibilities that exist outside the frame of his current life, was asking for something that Brian was the only person in the world who could give. Permission. Permission to change. Permission to stop being what the show required him to be. Permission to be more than a baby with a British accent and a secret villain identity. Brian did not give it. And so Stewie is still there, in the same room, being the same character, generation after generation of television season. Section 6. Brian Griffin's Hidden Tragedy. A brilliant person in an impossible situation. Brian Griffin's character arc across the show's full run is one of the most comprehensively argued about topics in the fan community, and most of that arguing centers on the question of what happened to him. Why the smart, warm, loyal friend of the early seasons became the arrogant, hypocritical, self-defeating figure of the later ones. The conventional answers are that the writers changed and the character lost its specificity, or that the show's overall drift toward cruelty caught Brian in its current along with everyone else. Both of these are true to some extent, but there are layers underneath both of them that deserve careful examination. Start with the foundational question that the show has never directly answered. What is Brian Griffin? Not narratively, we know the narrative surface. He is a talking dog who lives with the Griffins, drinks martinis, drives a car, writes bad novels, and serves as the show's internal voice of reason, or what passes for one. But what is he, in the sense that matters? What kind of being is this? The fan theory that Brian was once human, that he is a human consciousness inhabiting a canine body, either as the result of an experiment, a transformation, or some form of cosmological accident, is compelling not because of specific textual evidence, the show has never directly supported it, but because of the totality of his behavior. He does not simply behave like an intelligent animal. He behaves like a human being who is grieving a loss of form. The alcoholism is not a character quirk of an unusually sophisticated dog. It is the self-medication of someone who wakes up every morning in a body that is not the one he was supposed to have. The desperate literary ambition is not overreach by a talented animal. It is a man trying to perform the most human act he knows, the creation of literature, in order to prove to himself and the world that he is still, in the ways that matter, a person. The detail about his romantic relationships is perhaps the most clarifying. Brian does not simply date women. He falls in love with them in the specific, elaborate, devastated way that the romantically obsessed fall in love with the full force of someone for whom love is not an instinct but a need. Something sought with the intensity of the desperate. His heartbreaks are real heartbreaks. His longing is real longing. And the particular quality of his unrequited feeling for Lois, which the show has kept as a background element across the full run, never quite resolving it, has the texture of a love that was formed before the circumstances that now prevent it from being acted on, as if he loved Lois, or someone like her, before he became a dog, as if the feeling predates the situation. The alcoholism deterioration theory, developed by the Reddit user Grandmaster Sexay, is the most carefully constructed explanatory framework for what happened to Brian's character across the seasons, and it deserves the serious attention it has largely not received from mainstream discussions of the show. The argument runs as follows. Dogs' brains are physiologically different from human brains in ways that make them more vulnerable to the neurological effects of alcohol. A dog-sized brain processing the same volume of alcohol that a human character might metabolize relatively safely is undergoing proportionally greater neurochemical disruption. Brian's drinking, which has been heavy and consistent from the show's earliest episodes, is therefore doing cumulative neurological damage in ways that the show has never directly addressed, but that its narrative of his character's deterioration accurately reflects. The specific cognitive and personality changes associated with long-term alcohol dependence, the grandiosity, the declining self-awareness, the increase in aggressive and defensive behavior, the widening gap between self-image and actual conduct, the difficulty learning from painful experience are exactly the changes that Brian displays across the seasons. His arrogance is not a character choice by the writers. It is a symptom. His inability to learn from the consequences of his behavior is not lazy writing. It is what alcohol dependency does to a person's capacity for self-correction. If this reading is correct, the show has been running an understated portrait of addiction and its effects for 20 years, hiding it in the behavior of a talking dog, and virtually no one has noticed. This theory also retroactively gives the Quagmire speech from Jerome, "Is the new black a different significance?" Quagmire's demolition of Brian's character is, on the surface, the show using a character to say what the audience has been thinking to acknowledge that Brian has become insufferable and to articulate exactly why. But if Brian's deterioration is the result of alcohol dependency rather than simple character degradation, then Quagmire's speech is not a clear-eyed assessment. It is the judgment of a bystander who is watching someone spiral and is expressing his disdain rather than his concern. The show wanted the speech to feel like justice, the audience's frustration given voice, the pretentious hypocrite called out. But what it might actually be portraying, if you read it through the lens of the deterioration theory, is something sadder. A deeply unwell person being condemned by someone who cannot see what is happening to him, because the condemnation is more satisfying than the diagnosis. The theory that Brian is the author of the show, that the events of Family Guy are Brian's novel, the one he has been trying to write for the full 25-year run, is one of the most elegant pieces of meta-theory in the entire Iceberg. Proposed by Reddit user Reddit Alfie and expanded by subsequent commenters, the argument draws on several observable patterns. Brian is present in every episode, or virtually every episode, even those that have no narrative reason to include him. He is consistently positioned as observer, the character who stands slightly outside the chaos and annotates it rather than being wholly consumed by it. The show's particular intelligence, the way that even the most absurd material is framed with a certain dry awareness of its own absurdness, has Brian's voice rather than Peter's. If Brian is writing the show, then his terrible published work, the self-help book that Stewie ghostwrites. The novel he can never finish is his conscious work, the work he tries to make, and the show itself is his unconscious work, the thing he cannot stop producing even as he strains over the official projects. Every artist knows that their best work comes from the parts of themselves they are not trying to control. Brian's best work is the story of his own captivity, told with more honesty than he is capable of when he is consciously trying to be a writer. The death and return of Brian in Season 12 is, from any analytical perspective, one of the most revealing moments in the show's history, but what it reveals is not what the production intended. The episode, Life of Brian, kills Brian in circumstances that are genuinely affecting a random accident, a moment of bad timing, the specific cruelty of an ending that has no dramatic preparation and no narrative meaning. The grief that followed was real fan grief, not just for the character in his current degraded form, but for the Brian he had been in the early seasons, for the friend he had been, for the version of the show that Brian represented. The fan community's response was so intense and so widespread that it generated national news coverage. And then, 2 episodes later, Brian came back. Stewie used a time travel device to prevent his death. Brian was restored. Everything returned to the status quo. And the fan community's grief shifted almost instantly to anger, because the speed of the return confirmed that the death had been a trick, a ratings event. The show had exploited its own emotional history, had traded on 20 years of affection for this character to generate engagement during a period of declining viewership, with no intention of following through on what the death would have meant if it had been real. This is perhaps the single most damaging creative decision in the show's history, because it did not just betray the audience once. It permanently altered the terms of engagement. After you fake a death that convincingly and reverse it that quickly, nothing can be trusted. Every apparent consequence becomes provisional. Every character moment that seems meaningful becomes suspect. The show announced, through Brian's death and resurrection, that it was not in the business of meaning anymore. It was in the business of moments, shareable, discussable, trending topic moments, and it was willing to sacrifice its own integrity to produce them. Section 7. The Town, the World, the Rules of Reality, how the show's universe actually works. Family Guy's fictional universe has been running for long enough that it has accumulated something that most shows never develop: an actual internal physics. Not the physics of the real world. There are too many moments of cartoon impossibility for that, but a coherent set of internal rules about what is possible, what is permanent, what consequences mean, and how reality is structured in this particular place. Mapping those rules requires pulling together details from across 25 years of episodes, and the picture that emerges is stranger than most viewers have recognized. Begin with death, because death in the Family Guy universe is more philosophically complex than it appears. The show has a recurring character who is literally the Grim Reaper Death, an anthropomorphized skeleton in dark robes who appears when people die and performs the transition from life to whatever comes next. Death has been established across multiple episodes as a character with his own personality, his own frustrations, his own limitations. He can be inconvenienced, outwitted, injured. In the episode Death is a Bitch, he twists his ankle and is temporarily unable to perform his function, resulting in a period where literally no one can die. This is the most significant piece of information about how death works in the show's universe. It is a service, not a law. In the real world, death is an inevitability, a physical fact that follows from the cessation of biological process. In the Family Guy universe, death requires the participation of a specific supernatural agent. If that agent is unavailable, death does not happen. People who sustain fatal injuries simply do not die. The injury is real, the physical damage is real, but the transition is blocked. This is why the show's characters can survive things that should be instantly fatal. It is not that their bodies are magically durable, it is that death has not shown up to process the situation. This has an enormous implication that the show has never explicitly drawn out, but that is logically unavoidable. The Griffin family, and all the characters in the show's universe, are not simply lucky to be alive, despite their frequent near-fatal experiences. They are potentially immortal in the specific sense that their continued existence is contingent on death performing his function. And death is a character who can be distracted, negotiated with, and occasionally wrong in his timing. If you had the right relationship with death or the right circumstances, you might never have to die at all. The concept of time in the show is even more destabilized than this, and the instability is not a continuity failure, but a consequence of a specific in-universe cause. Stewie's time machine. The show has established, canonically, that the time machine works, that Stewie has used it repeatedly, that it produces real changes in the timeline, and that Stewie's relationship with time is therefore fundamentally different from every other character's. But here is what has never been explicitly acknowledged. The casual use of a functional time machine by a being with imperfect understanding and emotional volatility would naturally produce exactly the temporal incoherence the show displays. The characters age inconsistently because time has been disturbed. Events contradict previous events because the timeline has been rewritten. The show's famous inability to maintain continuity is not a production failure. It is the observable consequence of a universe whose temporal structure has been compromised by an infant with a remote control. This reading gives the show's continuity problems an internal logic they otherwise lack. When an episode contradicts something established in a previous episode, the in-universe explanation is that the timeline has been altered between the 2 points. Stewie went back and changed something, either intentionally or as a byproduct of another intervention, and the world that resulted is slightly different from the world that existed before the change. Most of the changes are small, a name remembered differently, a past event recalled with different details. Occasionally, the changes are large entire characters who exist in one set of episodes and do not exist in another, but they all share the same cause. The DeBoom episode and its implications for the show's canonical history deserve extended treatment here. DeBoom, which aired in December 1999, depicts a scenario in which the Y2K bug triggers a global nuclear apocalypse. Most of civilization is destroyed. The Griffins survive because Peter's paranoid preparation hiding the family in the basement accidentally places them in a position to survive the catastrophe. The survivors establish a new settlement around a Twinkie factory. Stewie mutates into a creature with octopus tentacles after exposure to nuclear waste. Peter becomes the founder and eventually the disgraced former leader of a new community. The episode ends with the revelation that it was all a dream, Peter waking up in bed, the apocalypse having never happened. The dream ending is the show's standard escape valve. But there is a fan theory, argued with more conviction than most, that the dream ending is itself fictional, that DeBoom is canon, that the apocalypse happened, that the normality of subsequent episodes is not the result of it having been a dream, but the result of someone, the most likely candidate being Stewie, with his time machine, having witnessed the catastrophe as a child in the year this episode was set, having gone back and prevented it. The world the show depicts from Season 2 onward is not the natural continuation of a world that happened to dodge a nuclear apocalypse. It is a world that was destroyed and rebuilt. The timeline was repaired, the memory of the destruction was suppressed, and the Griffins are living in a restored reality without knowing it. If DeBoom is canon, the implications are considerable. Every ordinary day in the Griffin household is a borrowed day in a borrowed world. The suburban normality of Spooner Street, with its barbecues and school buses and bar nights, is fragile in a way that the characters are not equipped to perceive. It was all destroyed once. It was all dark and radioactive and wrong. And only the intervention of someone with access to time travel pulled it back. The cheerful mundanity of the show is not the baseline. It is the exception. Ernie the Giant Chicken is one of the most enigmatic recurring elements in the entire show. The extended fight sequences between Peter and Ernie, which appear across multiple seasons, take up significant screen time, involve citywide destruction on a scale that would constitute major news events in a realistic world, and end with both combatants recovering fully and returning to their normal lives, are the show's most openly dreamlike element. The origin of the conflict, an expired coupon, is the most deliberate mismatch of cause and effect in a show that specializes in mismatched cause and effect. The fights are disproportionate in a way that is clearly intended to be funny, but that also signals, if you pay attention, that something else is happening. The fan theory that Peter and Ernie are the same entity, that the chicken is an external manifestation of Peter's own aggression, his ID made visible, and given an opponent to fight, is the most compelling reading of what the fights actually mean. Every time Peter encounters the chicken, the fight is really Peter encountering the fullest possible expression of his own destructive impulse. And the fact that neither can win, that the fights always end in a draw, both of them battered but alive, is the show's representation of the fundamental unresolvability of Peter's relationship with himself. You cannot defeat what you actually are. The best you can do is fight it to a standstill and go home. Section 8. The Simulation Theory and Multiverse Layers. What road to the multiverse actually opened? Road to the Multiverse is the 8th season premiere, and it is canonical. And what it establishes is genuinely radical within the show's internal logic. Stewie has built a device that allows travel between parallel universes. He has demonstrated that these universes are real, that they contain recognizable versions of the characters, and that the differences between them range from minor to total. The show treated this as the premise for a brilliant one-off adventure episode, and then largely declined to reckon with what it had established. What it established is this: the universe of Family Guy is one of an infinite number of parallel universes. The Griffin family, we follow the specific arrangement of personalities and relationships that constitute the show's cast, is one configuration among infinitely many. Stewie knows this. He has seen the other versions. He has interacted with them. And he chooses every episode to return to this particular universe, this particular family, this particular Spooner Street. That choice, made in full knowledge of the alternatives, is the most meaningful thing about him. But the multiverse episode's most important implication for the show's overall structure is not about Stewie's choices. It is about the status of continuity. In a universe with infinite parallel versions of the same characters, what does it mean for something to have happened? If there is a universe where Brian is dead and Stewie is grieving, and there is a universe where Brian is alive and Stewie is happy, both of those are real. Both exist simultaneously. The question of whether Brian is alive or dead has no single correct answer in a multiverse. It is simply a question of which universe you are currently occupying. This transforms the show's notorious resistance to permanent consequences from a creative failure into an accurate representation of its own physics. In a multiverse, nothing is permanently decided. Every death is real in one universe and reversed in another. Every relationship change is maintained in some realities and undone in others. The show's habit of resetting to the status quo after apparently significant events is not the writers being lazy. It is the universe, understood correctly, exerting its natural tendency toward restoration. The show lives in a multiverse, and multiverses do not naturally support permanence. The question of whether the pre-cancellation and post-cancellation versions of Family Guy are set in the same universe has been examined through this lens repeatedly. The evidence for them being different universes rather than different creative eras of the same show is stronger than most people realize. The family that exists in seasons 1 through 3 displays different fundamental values from the family that exists from season 4 onward. Not just different behavior, different values. The early Peter loves Meg in a specific way that the later Peter does not. The early Lois maintains a warmth toward her children that the later Lois has largely abandoned. The early Brian has a groundedness and a genuine kindness that the later Brian has mostly discarded. The Back to the Pilot episode, which sends Brian and Stewie back to the events of the first episode, is the piece of canonical evidence that the alternate universe theory relies on most heavily. In that episode, Brian and Stewie observe earlier versions of themselves. The earlier Brian is perceptibly different, warmer, more straightforwardly decent, less defended. The earlier Stewie is more openly menacing, more committed to his villain identity. These differences are not simply the result of the characters having changed over time. They are differences in kind, not in degree. The characters who inhabit the pilot are not the same souls as the characters who inhabit the later seasons. They are parallel universe counterparts, similar enough to recognize, different enough to feel the uncanniness. The theory that Family Guy is a television show within the universe of American Dad is one of the strangest and most canonically supported pieces of the Iceberg. In an American Dad episode, Stan Smith mentions Brian Griffin by name as his favorite fictional dog. This is the show explicitly positioning Family Guy as a piece of fiction within the American Dad universe. The Griffins are characters that Stan watches on television. Their lives are not real from his perspective. They are entertainment. But this creates a paradox, because American Dad and Family Guy have also had crossover episodes in which characters from both shows coexist in the same space and acknowledge each other's reality. In those episodes, the Griffins are not fictional, they are as present and real as the Smiths. So which is it? The answer the simulation theory provides is that both are simulations instantiated within a larger simulation, and the walls between them are imperfect. The crossover episodes are glitches, moments where the rendering engine fails to properly maintain the separation between the two instances, and characters from different simulations find themselves briefly in the same rendered space. Stan has watched Brian on TV and interacted with Brian in person, and both experiences are real within his subjective reality because his subjective reality is itself a simulation that contains both of those things as data. The implications of this for understanding the show are disorienting in a way that is actually useful. If the show is a simulation, or is nested within a series of simulations, each one watching the one beneath it, then the question of what the characters' experiences mean takes on a different quality. Their suffering is real to them. Their joy is real to them. The simulation does not make their inner lives fictional, it just places them in a context that is more complex and more fragile than it appears. They are real in the ways that matter, while existing in a structure that most of them are not equipped to perceive. Section 9. The darkest theories where the iceberg hits absolute zero. We are now below the level where light from the surface reaches, in territory where the pressure is extreme and the temperature has dropped to something that makes everything feel different. The theories in this section are the ones that most casual discussions of the show never reach. Some are too disturbing for lighthearted engagement. Some require a level of analytical commitment that most viewers do not extend to a comedy show. All of them illuminate something real about the show, its history, and its characters, even if none of them are literally correct about what the writers intended. The most comprehensive and most emotionally difficult theory about the show is the one that proposes that the entire fictional reality of Family Guy is the psychological construct of a broken Peter Griffin. Not a man playing a character in a show. A real man insofar as any character in a fiction is real, who experienced a catastrophe so complete that his mind built an alternative reality to survive it. The show, in this reading, is Peter's dream world. His protective fiction. His way of staying sane while holding something unbearable. The catastrophe, in the version of this theory that has been most carefully developed, involved a drunk driving accident. Meg was driving. There were deaths. Lois may have died, or Stewie may have died, or the child who died before the show began, whose existence Peter mentions in what the show treats as a quick dark joke, was the victim of that accident. Peter survived, with his guilt intact and his family irreparably changed. And in the aftermath of that catastrophe, he built the world of the show. A world where Lois is still alive and slightly exasperated by him, where Stewie is still alive and plotting against her, where the whole family is dysfunctional but together, where nothing ever permanently ends, because his mind will not permit it to end. This is why nothing in the show has lasting consequences. When Lois seems to die, she comes back. When Brian dies, he is restored. When relationships fracture, they repair. When characters do terrible things, they are forgiven by the next episode. It is not a production choice. It is a psychological necessity. The man constructing this world cannot afford to let it fail. He cannot let anyone in it permanently leave, because they have already permanently left in reality, and one loss like that is the absolute limit of what a person can bear. The theory also explains Meg's treatment in a way that the surface-level readings cannot fully accommodate. Peter's mind has constructed Meg as the character who receives all the cruelty, because somewhere in the fractured architecture of his constructed reality, Meg is associated with the loss. She was driving, or she was complicit, or she was the catalyst. The constructed Meg absorbs his anger because the real Peter cannot face what his actual feelings about her are. The cruelty the show presents as comedy is, in this reading, the distorted expression of a grief and a rage that have nowhere else to go. Stewie's extraordinary capabilities within this theory are what Peter's mind gave to the son or the child he needed to believe in. He could not save his family from what happened to them. He could not prevent the accident or undo its consequences. But in his constructed world, he gives the youngest member of his family the power to do the things he could not. Stewie has time travel. Stewie can undo death. Stewie has all the tools that Peter would have needed but did not have when it mattered. The evil genius baby is not a comedy character. He is Peter's unconscious wish for what his child could have been if the world had been different. The contaminated water theory takes a different angle on the same phenomenon of escalating dysfunction. We covered its basic premise earlier, but its darkest implication has not yet been addressed. If the deterioration of the characters across the show's run is the result of environmental poisoning of actual neurological damage accumulating in real time, then what we are watching is not the story of characters who get worse because the writers made bad creative choices. We are watching the story of a family that is being slowly destroyed by something they cannot see and have no idea how to fight. The cruelty is not a character trait. It is a symptom. The selfishness is not moral failure. It is impaired executive function. The inability to maintain relationships, to learn from experience, to control impulse, these are the specific cognitive effects of the kind of neurotoxic exposure the contaminated water theory describes. This reading of the show makes it genuinely tragic in a way that its comedy format prevents most viewers from recognizing. The Griffins are not bad people who do bad things because they are thoughtless or cruel. They are sick people who are doing what sick people do, without the awareness that they are sick or the resources to get help. And the world around them, the town, the neighbors, the institutions, is also sick, for the same reasons, which is why no one is equipped to help anyone else. The contaminated water has reached everyone. The poisoning is total. The dysfunction that the show presents as comedy is actually a community in slow-motion collapse. The meta-theory that the show is a self-portrait of its own deterioration, that the character's behavior tracks the show's creative decline in a way that is more intentional than it looks, is the one that will occupy my thoughts longest after this is over. The argument is this: Family Guy has been a show that has known, for a long time, that it is not what it was. The writers know. The network knows. The creator knows. And the show expresses this knowledge not through press releases or creative mission statements, but through the only medium it has: the behavior of its characters. Peter becomes crueler as the show loses its warmth. This is not just correlated with the show's declining quality, it is the show expressing its own declining warmth through the character who embodies that quality. Brian becomes more grandiose and self-deceiving as the show loses its self-awareness. Stewie loses his danger as the show loses its edge. Meg absorbs more punishment as the show loses its compassion. The show is not simply making its characters worse as a byproduct of lazy writing. The show is making its characters enact the specific qualities that the show itself is losing. They are the show's self-portrait, rendered in the language of character arc. If this is true, and I want to be clear that it may not be, that it may be finding pattern in coincidence, that it may be the kind of reading that the human mind performs automatically on any sufficiently complex text, then Family Guy has been confessing for 20 years. In every season that Peter's cruelty escalates, the show is telling you it is becoming crueler. In every season that Brian's pretension becomes more hollow, the show is telling you it is becoming more hollow. In every season that the cutaways grow longer and more disconnected, the show is telling you that it is losing its ability to maintain a coherent story. The confession is the show. And nobody can hear it because it is encoded in comedy. Section 10. Real-world connections and hidden messages, where the fiction touched reality. The most important real-world fact about Family Guy, more important than any rating or cancellation or renewal, more important than any award or controversy or critical reassessment, is that Seth MacFarlane was scheduled to be on American Airlines Flight 11 on the morning of September 11, 2001. He missed the flight by approximately 10 minutes. A combination of being out late the previous night and a miscommunication with his travel agency meant that he arrived at the gate after the doors had closed. He was turned away, he went to the airport bar, he watched the news with everyone else. Flight 11 was the first plane to hit the North Tower of the World Trade Center. If MacFarlane had been on it, Family Guy would have ended. Not immediately, the show had already been canceled once, and the reruns on Adult Swim were still in its future. But without MacFarlane, there is no voice work for Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire. No creative force to lead the revival, no advocate with Fox for bringing the show back. The 2005 return, the 20-plus subsequent seasons, the cultural footprint of one of the most recognized animated franchises in the world. None of it exists if MacFarlane is standing at that gate 10 minutes earlier. The show as we know it is the direct product of a 10-minute delay. MacFarlane has addressed this multiple times in the years since. He has been consistently thoughtful and careful about how he discusses it, neither minimizing the loss of the people who were on Flight 11 nor dramatizing his own close call beyond what it warrants. He has said that he believes in fate, not in the simple sense that everything happens for a reason, but in the sense that the architecture of causality is more complex than we usually perceive. He arrived at the gate too late, and he was alive. Other people arrived on time. He holds that fact with a seriousness that is visible when he discusses it, and that seriousness is, I think, part of what shaped the show's early seasons, a creative work made by someone who understood, at a level that most people never have to understand, that the opportunity to make something could be taken away at any moment. The Kevin Spacey joke is the show's most famous apparent prediction, and it sits in a complicated space between coincidence and something that is hard to name. In a 2005 episode, Stewie runs through a department store shouting that he has escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. In 2017, Spacey was the subject of extensive public allegations regarding his behavior. The show made that joke 12 years earlier. MacFarlane has said clearly that the writers knew nothing about Spacey's actual conduct that the reference was constructed purely as a dark joke, using Spacey's public persona as a vehicle, in the way that the show has always used celebrities as material. But the show has a documented history of moments like this, jokes that landed as dark comedy when they were written, and that later events rendered something more unsettling than comedy. The question of whether this reflects anything meaningful about the creative process of satirical comedy has been seriously discussed in academic contexts. The argument is that satirical writers, in order to construct effective jokes about public figures, are required to model those figures' psychology more carefully than ordinary public engagement demands. They have to think about what kind of person this is, what the fullest expression of their known characteristics would look like, what happens if the things that are merely implied become explicit. This process is, in a limited sense, a form of predictive modeling. And predictive models are occasionally right. The show's treatment of its network has been one of the most openly autobiographical running jokes in its history. Family Guy has been airing on Fox for 25 years, while its creator has been increasingly vocal about his discomfort with that association. MacFarlane's public statements about Fox News, which shares corporate lineage with the broadcast network that airs his show, have grown steadily more explicit over the years. In 2021, he posted that he wished Family Guy was on any other network, comparing his situation to a failing marriage where both sides know it is not working. In 2020, he signed a deal with NBC Universal worth approximately $200 million over 5 years, moving his production company effectively out of the Fox ecosystem for all future projects. Family Guy remained on Fox only by virtue of pre-existing contractual obligations. This means that for the last several years of the show's run, the person whose name is on the title has been contractually obligated to provide voice work for a show on a network he has publicly said he wants to leave, while his actual creative energies and business relationships have been committed to a completely different corporate entity. The show that bears his name is not, in any meaningful sense, his show anymore. It is a legacy obligation running on institutional inertia and contractual necessity. The April 2025 renewal deal, which extended the show through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season, was negotiated with Disney, which now owns Fox's entertainment assets. The show that MacFarlane wanted to leave will apparently run until 2029. The real-world history of the show's writers' strikes is another piece of context that has shaped the show in ways most viewers have not fully accounted for. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild of America strike lasted approximately 3 months, from November of 2007 to February of 2008. MacFarlane was a prominent supporter of the striking writers, visible on picket lines, vocal in his advocacy for the Guild's position on residuals and digital distribution rights. During the strike, Fox made the decision to air 3 completed Family Guy episodes without MacFarlane's approval, a decision he resented. When the strike ended, the show resumed, but the disruption to the production cycle was significant. Television writing rooms develop creative rhythms over months and years of working together. A 3-month break in that rhythm, combined with the stress and the political conflict of the strike period, does not resolve the moment work resumes. The effects linger. The 2023 Writers Guild strike disrupted the show again, and MacFarlane was again visibly present on the picket line. The consistency of his labor advocacy across 2 major strikes, and the tension this creates with his contractual relationship to the studios and networks that his advocacy has sometimes targeted, is one of the more interesting biographical contradictions in his public persona. He is simultaneously the person most associated with the business success of Family Guy, the franchise that generates licensing deals and streaming revenue and merchandise, and someone with a genuine, demonstrated commitment to the labor rights of the writers who have actually been making the show for the past 15 years in his absence. The show's production timeline is a real-world fact that changes how you experience it if you hold it in mind. A single episode of Family Guy takes approximately a year to produce from initial concept to broadcast. The writing room breaks the story. The scripts go through multiple drafts. The storyboards are produced. The voice recording sessions happen. The animation is produced by overseas studios. The finished frames are returned and edited, sound design and color correction are applied, and only then does the episode air. The implications of this are not trivial. Any joke about current events that you watch on Family Guy was written approximately 12 months before you see it. Any reference to a cultural phenomenon that seems timely was locked in before that phenomenon had fully resolved. The show cannot react to the world in real time, no matter how topical it appears to be. It is always looking at the recent past and presenting it as the present. This is one reason that Family Guy's political content has aged so poorly. It was always slightly behind the curve, presenting last year's cultural conversation as if it were today's. Section 11. Creator intent versus fan interpretation. What was put there and what was found there. This section requires the most careful thinking, because the most common analytical failure in discussions of hidden content in media is the conflation of intention and implication. A text contains what its creators put in it, and it also contains things that follow from what the creators put in it that they may not have fully intended. Both are real. Both are worth discussing. But they require different frameworks. And mixing them produces the kind of analysis that feels insightful in the moment and falls apart under examination. There are things in Family Guy that were clearly and deliberately placed there by the writers. The opening theme, as homage to All in the Family, intentional, documented, confirmed by the creator. Stewie's blocks spelling red rum in a season 1 episode intentional, an explicit Shining reference that is calibrated specifically to Stewie's character. The Gumball to Gumball reference, which names a real television concept McFarlane pitched to Fox before Family Guy, an intentional in-joke. The creator acknowledging his own history with the network that first rejected his work. The Chris Griffin voice, originating from Seth Green's Buffalo Bill, impression intentional, in the sense that Green made the choice and the casting team endorsed it, with the show later acknowledging the connection explicitly. Then there are things that the show placed in its world without intending them to carry significance, that have accumulated significance anyway through the sheer passage of time and the attentiveness of fans. The Lost Child reference, treated as a quick dart gag and never followed up on, that has become the basis of an extensive fan theory about the family's emotional architecture. The Quagmire age reference, placed as a joke and intended as a joke, that fans have taken as a genuine piece of character biography. The Stewie gun request in Brian and Stewie, which the show has never returned to, that has become the most discussed loose thread in the show's history. The question of what the show intended by its treatment of Meg is perhaps the most contested issue in this territory, because the show has sent contradictory signals about it across 25 years of episodes. The seasons of relentless cruelty toward Meg suggest one thing, that the writers found a reliable source of humor in her suffering and used it without much ethical consideration. The episodes that treat Meg with genuine dignity and allow her character to develop, the crossover episode where she bonds with Lisa Simpson, the Peter sister episode that attempts to explain the abuse dynamic with real psychological seriousness. The later season's gradual reduction in the extreme cruelty suggests something different, that at least some of the writers knew what they were doing was wrong and wanted to do something else. The most honest assessment is probably that the show's treatment of Meg reflects the evolution of the comedy industry's relationship to misogyny more broadly. An initial period where cruelty toward the show's main female teenager was normalized and rewarded with audience response, followed by a gradual, incomplete, occasionally backsliding process of correction as the cultural context changed and as the people in the writing room changed. The addition of more women to the writing staff in the later seasons coincided, not coincidentally, with the reduction in the most extreme Meg abuse. The people who pushed back most effectively against the cruelty were the people who did not find the cruelty funny to begin with, because it was describing something from their experience rather than someone else's. The debate about whether Brian's deterioration was intentional is one where the show has been more consistent in sending signals than is usually acknowledged. In the Jerome is the New Black episode, the show had Quagmire articulate, in explicit and specific detail, exactly what Brian had become and why it was insufferable. This is the show saying it knows. It is the writers acknowledging, through a character who functions as audience surrogate in that moment, that they are aware Brian has become a problem. The question that follows from this acknowledgement is why, knowing that, the show continued to make Brian worse, rather than using the moment as a turning point. The most charitable interpretation is that the writers intended the Quagmire speech as the beginning of a character arc, as the moment of confrontation that would catalyze Brian's recognition of his own worst qualities, eventually lead him toward something better. If that was the intention, it failed in execution. The arc never materialized. Brian continued to be exactly what Quagmire described him as, and in some respects became more so. The least charitable interpretation is that the speech was an acknowledgement without intention of change, a way of proving that the show was self-aware about its own problems, without actually doing anything about them. The show could claim to know better because it had said so, even as it continued doing what it knew was wrong. Seth MacFarlane's relationship to the show's later creative identity is the most important single factor in understanding why the intentional and the accidental have become so difficult to disentangle in the show's later seasons. MacFarlane has confirmed that he stopped writing for the show around 2010. He continued doing voice work, which means he was in the recording booth, voicing the characters, hearing the scripts, but was not a creative participant in the decisions that shaped the material. This is an unusual situation for a show that is still publicly presented as a Seth MacFarlane production. His name is on it, his voice is in it, but the creative choices that have defined it for 15 years are not his. MacFarlane described the show's continued existence in a 2024 interview, primarily in terms of financial utility. It generates income that funds causes he cares about. It continues to exist because the audience exists. And there is no compelling creative reason to end it, because he does not have a specific artistic vision that requires ending it. This is a very different framing from the creator of an ongoing artistic project. It is the framing of someone who is managing a legacy asset. The show is not something he is making. It is something he is allowing to continue. And the difference between those two relationships to a creative work produces exactly the kind of show that Family Guy has been for the past 15 years. Technically competent, occasionally inspired, fundamentally rudderless. Section 12. The final depth theories that change everything about what you have been watching. We are at the absolute bottom now. The part of the iceberg that exists in near total darkness, where the only light is what you brought with you. The theories in this final section are the ones that, if you accept them, do not simply add information to your understanding of the show, they reorganize your entire relationship to it. They ask you to step back from the surface completely and ask what this object actually is, beneath everything it appears to be. The foundational theory at the bottom of this particular iceberg, the one I want to lay out in full before building toward the final synthesis, is the idea that Family Guy is not, at its core, a comedy. I do not mean this in the simple sense that it contains dark material alongside the humor. Many comedies do. I mean it in the sense that the show's deepest function, the thing it is actually doing, in the minds and hearts of the people who make it and the people who watch it, is not comedy. It is something else. Something that requires the comedy as a container, because the alternative containers drama, tragedy, documentary, are either unavailable in this format or would not survive the material. Family Guy, in this reading, is a sustained examination of what American working-class family life does to the people inside it. Not a satire of it, not a parody. An examination. Peter Griffin is not a comedic exaggeration of a working-class father. He is a working-class father, and the comedy is the residue of his situation, the defense mechanism that the audience and the characters alike deploy to make the material bearable. He is a man of limited intelligence and limited education and limited emotional vocabulary, who is responsible for the welfare of 4 people and a dog, in circumstances that would challenge someone twice as capable. He fails constantly. He fails in ways that hurt people. He keeps being given the opportunity to try again, and he keeps failing again, and the show calls this comedy because there is no other genre adequate to what it is actually describing. Lois is not a comic housewife with a ridiculous husband. She is a woman who made a choice in her 20s that foreclosed every other choice, who has spent her adult life in a house and a marriage and a role that she did not fully understand she was choosing when she chose them. Her increasing coldness across the seasons is not a creative failure. It is the accurate portrait of someone who has been managing a household and 3 children and a husband with the cognitive profile of a much younger person for 25 years without adequate resources or genuine recognition. The warmth depletes. It does not replenish. And the show calls the depletion comedy because what else can you do with it? Meg is not a punchline. She is the show's most honest character, and the hostility directed at her is the show's most dishonest response to what it has created. Meg wants to be loved. She wants her parents to be proud of her. She wants friends who see her as someone worth knowing. These are among the most fundamental human desires, and they are desires that the show has spent roughly 10 seasons punishing her for having. The comedy of Meg's suffering depends on the audience agreeing, at some level, that her desires are excess, that her wanting to be loved is somehow pathetic rather than simply human. The show cannot function if the audience stops agreeing to that premise. And the fact that the fan community has been increasingly reluctant to agree to it, that Meg has become one of the show's most sympathetic figures, rather than one of its easiest targets, is the audience gradually withdrawing the consent that the cruelty required. Brian is not a failed writer who is also a dog. He is a portrait of intelligence, without context of what happens to a person of genuine capability, when the world has systematically misclassified them, when the category they have been placed in by circumstances of birth forecloses the recognition their qualities would otherwise receive. He is brilliant enough to know exactly what he is losing, and that exact knowledge is the specific quality of his suffering. An animal without self-awareness does not grieve its own condition. A human intelligence, aware of everything it cannot be, inhabiting a body that the world does not take seriously, does. Stewie is not a funny baby. He is the show's most complete portrait of loneliness. And the only reason this has taken this long to recognize is that his loneliness is wrapped in more layers of protective performance than any other character's. The villain identity, the British accent, the world domination plans, these are armor. The person underneath the armor is someone who exists outside the normal parameters of social life and cannot find a way back inside them, who has capabilities that isolate rather than connect, who has experienced time and reality in ways that make ordinary human company feel impossible, who has exactly one genuine connection in all the world, and who would burn down everything he has built to preserve it. The theory at the very bottom of this iceberg is not a fan theory, strictly speaking. It is an observation about what the show is. And the observation is this: Family Guy has been a confession for 25 years, not a deliberate one. Not a confession anyone intended to make, but a confession nonetheless. The show confesses, in the behavior of its characters, what it is losing. As the warmth drains from the writing room, the characters become colder. As the self-awareness atrophies, the characters become more grandiose and less capable of honest self-assessment. As the edge disappears, the characters become safer and less dangerous. As the compassion is abandoned, the characters become crueler. The show is not simply deteriorating in a way that has no meaning. The show is deteriorating in a way that its characters enact, and the enactment is, in the only medium available to it, the show's way of saying that it knows. This is beautiful if it is true, because it means that the show has never fully lost itself. The confessing is the show remaining present with its own loss. The characters are the show's way of staying honest about what is being taken from it, season by season, by the pressures of commercial production and creative fatigue, and the withdrawal of the person who made it. And watching the show with this in mind, watching Peter's cruelty and reading it as the show's own cruelty toward itself, watching Brian's self-deception and reading it as the show's inability to face what it has become, watching Stewie's gentleness and reading it as the show, mourning the danger it used to have, transforms the whole enterprise from a disappointing commercial object into something with a strange and genuine pathos. The show that aired on January 31st, 1999, had something in it that was genuinely original and genuinely warm and genuinely alive. The show that will air until 2028 or 2029, guaranteed by a corporate deal with the parent company of the network that has owned it for 25 years, is that same show's long shadow. But shadows are not nothing. They are evidence of light. And somewhere in the iceberg and the theories and the hidden details and the production history and the long argument about what the show is and what it was and what it lost there is the outline of that original light, preserved in the record of what the show was before it became what it is. That is the bottom of the iceberg. That is what lives down here in the dark. at the pressure and the temperature that only this kind of deep, sustained attention can reach. A comedy show about a cartoon family that is also, if you look carefully and long enough, a confession about everything that comedy costs when you make it for long enough without the thing that made it worth making in the first place. If you made it this far, and I genuinely mean it when I say thank you, because this is the kind of content that only works if there are people willing to go all the way to the bottom, please like the video. It took a long time, and it means more to the channel than you probably realize. Subscribe if you have not already, because there are more icebergs where this one came from, and they go just as deep. Drop your location and the time you are watching in the comments, and let me know which theory landed hardest for you. Which one changed something for you? Which one you are going to be thinking about the next time you put on a Family Guy episode? Stay curious, go deep, and remember that the most interesting part of anything is always the part you cannot see from the surface. I will see you at the next one. Expanded supplemental deep dives, going even further down. The Ernie the Giant Chicken. A full mythology. The giant chicken deserves more space than the brief mention earlier in this script, because Ernie is genuinely one of the show's strangest and most symbolically loaded recurring elements, and the depth of fan analysis around him is considerably more extensive than most people realize. Let us do this properly. Ernie the Giant Chicken first appeared in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, where a man in a chicken suit warned Peter about the Y2K bug and gave him a coupon that turned out to be expired. Peter's response to the expired coupon was an extended, city-leveling fight sequence that lasted for minutes of screen time, destroyed significant portions of the fictional town's infrastructure, involved multiple locations, and ended with both combatants apparently dead before both recovered and returned to their normal lives. The show treated this fight as one of its most extended physical comedy sequences, and the audience responded to it immediately. The fights became a recurring element, appearing across seasons with increasing ambition and spectacle. The most recent versions of the chicken fight have lasted over 5 minutes and involved set pieces that include speeding vehicles, collapsing buildings, and combat at the edge of space. The expired coupon origin is one of the show's most deliberately disproportionate premises. An expired coupon is one of the smallest and most trivial forms of petty commercial inconvenience. The idea that this specific irritation could generate a grudge intense enough to produce multi-season fight choreography is the joke, and the show knows it is the joke. But the question fans have been asking for 20 years is, what is the joke actually about? The most compelling answer in the fan community goes back to Peter's psychology. Peter Griffin's entire characterization is built around a specific quality of emotion. The intensity of his responses is always calibrated incorrectly to the situation that prompts them. He overreacts to small things and underreacts to large ones. He treats trivial concerns as emergencies and genuine emergencies as trivial. The expired coupon fight is not a standalone absurdity. It is the purest possible expression of Peter's fundamentally misaligned emotional thermostat. The chicken is not really about the chicken. The chicken is about the fact that Peter cannot regulate the scale of his responses, and Ernie is the universe that Peter has created to absorb the excess. Every time Peter fights Ernie, the town is damaged, strangers are hurt, and property is destroyed. These are real consequences borne by the wider community, because one man cannot process a minor grievance without externalizing it at maximum intensity. The show presents this as comedy, but the pattern and individual's inability to manage his own responses causing widespread damage to people who have nothing to do with the original irritation is the pattern of a great many real-world disasters, personal and political and institutional. The giant chicken is the perfect symbol for what unregulated grievance does to a community, and the show has been running that symbol for 25 years without drawing the connection explicitly. It did not need to. The connection is there for anyone who looks. The fact that neither Peter nor Ernie can ever fully win is the theory's most powerful element. The fights always end in a draw. Both combatants are battered, apparently finished, and then both recover and part ways until the next encounter. The fight never resolves. It never concludes. It simply pauses and resumes. This is exactly what happens when a person fights a manifestation of their own emotional patterns. You cannot defeat them, because defeating them would require becoming a different person, and the fight itself is preventing that transformation. You keep fighting your own nature, and you keep surviving the fight. Because losing would mean actually changing. There is also a detail in the chicken fights that most viewers miss because it happens too quickly. Both Peter and Ernie, after each fight, go directly back to whatever they were doing before. The world around them treats the fights as if they have not happened. The buildings are repaired, the cars are replaced, the injured bystanders are simply absent from subsequent scenes. The fights are, in narrative terms, consequence-free. They occur in a separate register from the show's main reality, visible to us but treated as non-events by everyone except the two combatants. This is consistent with the reading of Ernie as a symbol of Peter's internal life rather than an external character. The fight happens in Peter's psychology. The damage is real to him. The world does not register it because the world is not the target. The death of dialogue. How the show replaced communication with noise. One of the most under-discussed aspects of the show's decline is not the content of the humor but the structure of conversation within it. In the early seasons, the show's characters communicated with each other in ways that had real emotional texture. Conversations had direction. They revealed character through what people chose to say and what they chose not to say. They built on each other in ways that felt organic and that occasionally led to genuinely surprising places. The dialogue was the architecture through which the characters' relationships were expressed, and you could read those relationships accurately from attentive viewing of how people spoke to each other. By the later seasons, dialogue in the show had largely collapsed into two functions: setup for cutaways and the delivery of exposition. Characters said things in order to trigger the format. Cut the classic, "This is worse than the time when." That leads to a disconnected gag, or they said things in order to advance the episode's plot mechanics forward to the next beat. What they almost never did was talk to each other in a way that revealed who they were, or what they felt, or how they understood each other. The conversations became functional rather than relational. And the loss of relational dialogue is inseparable from the loss of the sense that these people actually know each other. The Peter and Lois relationship illustrates this most clearly. In the early seasons, their conversations, even the arguments, even the absurd exchanges, conveyed a specific quality of intimacy that was hard to locate in a single line, but was unmistakably present in the accumulation of them. You could tell, from watching them talk, that these two people had years of history together, and that their communication was shaped by that history. The things they chose not to say directly were as present as the things they said. In the later seasons, Peter and Lois exchange lines rather than have conversations. They communicate functionally. He did a thing, she has a reaction, the episode moves on. The intimacy has drained away, and what has replaced it is the form of conversation without the substance. This is connected to the cutaway problem in a way that is easy to miss. Cutaways do not simply interrupt stories, they interrupt relationships. When a conversation is broken by a cutaway, when two characters are in the middle of a moment that is building towards something, and the show jumps away before that something can arrive, what is lost is not just the narrative beat. What is lost is the felt continuity of the relationship between those two characters. Every cutaway that interrupts a genuine character moment is a small erasure of the sense that these people are real to each other. Enough small erasures, over enough episodes, over enough seasons, and you end up with a show whose characters are present in the same scenes but are not actually present to each other. The hidden narrative of Lois Griffin. Lois deserves more space than this script has given her. Because the reading of Lois as the show's most quietly tragic figure, more tragic, even, than Meg, is one that requires careful argument. Lois Griffin began as one of the most competent characters on the show. She was the functional adult in a household that would have collapsed without her. She was the person who understood what was happening, who maintained the structures that made ordinary life possible, who loved her husband's flaws with the specific patience of someone who had made peace with an imperfect choice. The early Lois had a quality that is difficult to name but easy to recognize. She was present in her scenes, in her relationships, in her experience of her own life. The Lois of the later seasons is not present. She has withdrawn into a version of herself that is thinner, meaner, less interested. She delivers her lines with a quality of absence, as if the person who once inhabited this character has gradually vacated the premises and left behind a shell who knows all the right words but cannot connect them to feeling. This is usually attributed to the writers losing interest in her character, and in part it is. But the fan reading that finds this withdrawal meaningful, that traces the emotional arc of a woman whose resources were spent on people who could not or would not replenish them, and whose gradual disappearance from herself is the natural endpoint of 25 years of exactly that dynamic, produces a more interesting portrait than the creative failure reading. The Pewter Schmidt money is the key. Lois chose poverty, in relative terms, when she chose Peter. She chose not to use the resources her family's wealth could provide. She chose to build something from scratch, in the belief or the hope, or the fantasy that love was sufficient capital. The early seasons show this choice as admirable. The later seasons show its costs. The warmth that characterized early Lois was not simply her personality. It was what she paid forward in lieu of material. Support the investment of emotional resource in a household that needed it. When those resources were spent, the warmth went with them. What remains is the woman who made the choice and is now living in its full consequences, with the bill being presented and no remaining account from which to pay it. There are two Lois Griffins in the full run of the show, and the distance between them is the distance between who she expected to become when she made her choice and who that choice actually made her. The show has never acknowledged this directly. The two versions of Lois exist in the same timeline, voiced by the same actress, answering to the same name. But they are not the same person. And the gap between them is one of the show's most honest admissions about the nature of long marriages, expensive choices, and the particular way that love can become invisible when it is required rather than offered. The mythology of Spooner Street. The neighborhood itself, Spooner Street, the residential block where the Griffins, the Swansons, Quagmire, and in earlier seasons the Brown family all live, is a character in the show, and one that the fan community has mapped with obsessive precision. The inconsistencies in the street's geography, the houses that appear and disappear, the spatial relationships between properties that shift depending on what the plot requires. These are the most visible signs of the show's loose relationship with its own internal continuity, but they are also the basis of several theories about the nature of the space. The most interesting Spooner Street theory is the one that frames the neighborhood as a kind of sealed system, a community that exists in deliberate isolation from the broader world, and whose members are connected to each other by something more than geographical proximity. The show has, across multiple seasons, put the same small group of people in the same bar, the same block, the same social circle, through an extraordinary range of circumstances. Crises that should scatter a community instead seem to reinforce the gravitational pull that keeps these specific people together. Characters who leave Cleveland Brown and his family, who got their own spin-off series, eventually return. Characters who should logically have moved, in response to what the show has put them through, inexplicably remain. The theory frames this persistence as meaningful, rather than as a production convenience. These people cannot leave Spooner Street, because Spooner Street is where their story is happening, and their story is not yet finished. Whatever the narrative, whether you read it as comedy, tragedy, purgatory, simulation, or Peter's dream, requires this group of people in this specific place, and the gravitational pull that keeps them there is the narrative itself, requiring its characters to remain in position for the next episode, and the episode after that, and the episode after that, for 25 years and counting. This is the show's deepest admission about what it is. It is not a story that ends, it is a story that continues because the continuing is the point. The Griffin family is not in a show about their lives. Their lives are a show, and shows do not end for the characters inside them. They only end for the audience, when the audience stops watching. As long as someone is watching, Spooner Street exists, and the characters wake up every episode in their correct positions and do what they do, and nothing changes in any fundamental way, and the story continues. That is the mythology of Spooner Street. That is the deepest theory in the Iceberg. The neighborhood is not a setting. It is a trap that nobody chose and nobody can escape. And the comedy is the sound that the trap makes when you stop struggling and start laughing at the elegance of its design. The last word on the iceberg. Every iceberg eventually ends. Not at the bottom. Icebergs do not have neat bottoms, but at the point where the ice gives way to the ocean floor, where the structure becomes indistinguishable from the thing it has been floating in all along. The Family Guy iceberg ends here, with the recognition that the show and everything it contains, the theories, the hidden details, the accidental depths, The deliberate shallows, the 25 years of creative choices, good and bad, is floating in something larger than itself. It is floating in the culture that created it, and that it has in turn shaped. Family Guy changed what animated comedy was allowed to be. Not alone South Park was doing the same thing in a different register, and The Simpsons had done it first in a different way but distinctively, in ways that are still visible in the animation landscape today. It demonstrated that an animated show could be adult, not just in its content, but in its emotional ambition. That the cartoon format was not a limitation, but a specific tool for a specific kind of truth-telling. One that required the safety of the cartoon to say things that a more realistic format would render unbearable. And then it spent 20 years demonstrating what happens when a tool is misused, when the specific intelligence that makes the format work is replaced by habits and formulas, and the reliable production of content without the animating idea behind it. The iceberg is the record of both things. The surface is the formula. The depths are the intelligence. And the distance between the surface and the bottom is the distance between what the show became and what it was. If you are watching Family Guy now, and you are watching it knowing what is at the bottom of the iceberg, knowing about the lost warmth and the broken timeline, and the theories about what the show has been confessing, you are watching it differently than you were before. Not better, necessarily, but with more of the picture. With the bottom visible even when you are looking at the surface. That is what icebergs are for. The Quagmire-Brian feud. A case study in the show's moral confusion. The sustained feud between Quagmire and Brian, which became one of the most prominent ongoing dynamics in the show's later seasons, is worth examining in full because it crystallizes the show's deepest moral confusion in a single relationship. Both characters are, by any objective assessment, deeply flawed. Quagmire is a serial sexual predator who has been shown to commit acts in the show that would be crimes if the show were willing to call them what they are. Brian is a self-aggrandizing hypocrite whose intelligence does not match his self-perception and whose treatment of the people around him is frequently callous. Yet the show has consistently positioned Quagmire as the morally credible voice of judgment on Brian, and the audience has largely accepted this positioning. The famous speech in Jerome is the New Black, in which Quagmire catalogs Brian's failings with surgical specificity, was designed to function as a moment of clarity the show, using one character to say what the audience was thinking, to acknowledge out loud what had become visible to attentive viewers. And in terms of its accuracy regarding Brian, the speech is correct. Everything Quagmire says is supported by things the show has depicted. Brian's pretension, his hypocrisy, his failed writing career, and the gap between his self-image as an intellectual and his actual output. His treatment of women, specifically including Lois, his abandonment of his biological son, all of it is accurate, but the show does not examine the identical dynamics in Quagmire with anything approaching the same rigor. Quagmire's relationship with Lois is not more respectful than Brian's. It is different in kind and arguably worse in degree. Quagmire has, within the show's canon, had affairs with multiple married women in the neighborhood, including Cleveland's wife, Loretta. He has tricked Joe into granting him permission to sleep with Bonnie. He has stalked Lois. He has been arrested for peeping. He has committed acts the show acknowledges as criminal in the real world, but treats as character quirks. And none of this is ever subjected to the same scrutiny as Brian's behavior. Quagmire's speech is treated as wisdom from a credible moral authority, when in fact it is delivered by someone whose own moral record is at least as troubling as Brian's. The show is making an argument, whether it intends to or not, about the relative visibility of different kinds of bad behavior. Brian's is visible because it wears the costume of sophistication his pretensions invite puncturing. His hypocrisy is the kind that educated people find particularly offensive. His arrogance has the quality of the arrogance that audiences have been trained to dismiss. Quagmire's is invisible because it wears the costume of masculine directness. He does not pretend to be something he is not. He is openly what he is, and the show treats that openness as a form of honesty that Brian's self-deception lacks. The show confuses transparency about one's flaws with the absence of those flaws. Quagmire tells you he is terrible, Brian pretends he is not. The show rewards Quagmire's honesty about his terribleness by allowing it to grant him moral authority over Brian's dishonesty about his own. This is not actually coherent as ethics, but it functions as comedy, and the show has never needed it to be more than that. The Meg situation. Everything wrong in one character arc. Meg Griffin's trajectory is the show's most compressed history of its own values, and examining it carefully produces a map of exactly where those values went wrong and exactly where they began, eventually, to right themselves. Meg in seasons 1 through 3 is not simply the boring one. She is the character who exists in a specific relationship to the show's central comedic logic. She is the most ordinary member of a family defined by extremity, and the comedy of her situation is the comedy of normalcy, encountering abnormality rather than the other way around. She is the teenager trying to live a recognizable teenage life, while her family produces chaos around her. The show's early Meg is a character you can project yourself onto, if you are a teenage girl, or remember projecting yourself onto, if you were once one. She wants what teenagers want. She wants to be seen, to be loved, to belong somewhere. And the show treats these desires as real and legitimate rather than as sources of comedy. The shift that happened in the post-revival seasons is not simply that Meg became more of a target for jokes. The shift is that the show changed its relationship to what Meg's desires represented. In the early seasons, Meg's desire to be loved is sympathetic. In the later seasons, Meg's desire to be loved becomes the thing the show mocks her for having. She is not mocked for being ordinary. She is mocked for wanting, for expecting, for believing she deserves the basic dignities that her family provides to everyone except her. The cruelty targets the desire itself, the audacity of wanting love when you are Meg Griffin, and this is categorically different from the gentle comedy of her early characterization. The Seahorse Seashell Party episode is the most written about single episode in Meg's arc, and it deserves the attention it has received. In this episode, Meg confronts her family with the accuracy and specificity of someone who has been cataloging every hurt and has finally reached the threshold of what she can absorb. She does not yell. She does not cry. She is calm and precise and correct about everything she says. And the episode allows her this precision as a genuine character moment, as close to a Meg triumph as the show had produced at that point. Then the episode does what the show was apparently constitutionally unable to stop itself from doing. It takes the moment away. The mechanism by which the moment is taken away is one of the most revealing in the show's history. Without Meg to serve as the family's shared target, the family falls apart. Peter and Lois and Chris and Brian turn on each other. The dynamic that kept them together, the shared outlet, the mutually agreed upon scapegoat, the person whose suffering provided everyone else with relief is no longer operational, and the alternative is that they must face their own dysfunction without the buffer. Meg, observing this, chooses to restore the buffer. She goes back to being the punching bag because she has decided that being the thing that holds her family together, even in this terrible form, is better than watching them destroy each other. The show probably intended this as a bittersweet moment of Meg's strength and sacrifice. What it produced instead was one of the most disturbing messages in a mainstream animated comedy. That victims of sustained abuse should accept their victimhood because the alternative, the exposure of the actual dysfunction that their victimhood is masking, is worse for everyone involved. This is not a comedic reading. This is the logic of abuse. You should keep absorbing this because the family needs you to. You should be what I need you to be because what happens to me if you stop is your responsibility. Meg, accepting this, is a teenage girl internalizing one of the most damaging beliefs that abuse produces in its victims. The fact that later seasons genuinely pulled back from the worst of this, that by season 22 or so, the extreme abuse had largely stopped, that Meg was given episodes in which she was competent and strong and treated with basic dignity, is a real thing, and it matters. The addition of more women to the writing staff is widely credited with this change, and it is a change worth acknowledging and praising. But the 10 years of content between the shift and the correction exists. It cannot be edited retroactively, and what it says about the values of the people making it during those years is not altered by the fact that eventually someone pushed back effectively enough that it stopped. What the numbers actually tell you. The ratings history of Family Guy is not simply a record of commercial performance. It is a documentary about cultural engagement, about when and how and why millions of people made the choice to spend their attention on this specific thing, and when and how and why they gradually stopped. The premiere drew 22 million viewers, This number is inflated by the Super Bowl lead-in, as we discussed. But even accounting for that inflation, it represents a genuine cultural event. People watched, were interested, and told other people. The show built an audience not through the mechanical process of network promotion, but through the organic process of audience recommendation. In the years before social media made organic recommendation visible and measurable, word-of-mouth television success looked like exactly what Family Guy produced. Steady viewership that slightly exceeded what the show's promotion budget should have been able to produce. The cancellation and revival story is a commercial miracle. The numbers on Adult Swim, that 239% boost to viewership, represent an audience that had been waiting and actively missing the show. The 400,000 DVD copies sold in a period when DVD represented a meaningful commercial investment on the part of the buyer. These are not passive audience metrics. These are active expressions of preference. People were voting with money for the show to continue. Fox heard the vote. The 2005 revival was not a creative decision. It was a market response to demonstrated demand. From that revival high point, the decline was gradual enough to explain away season by season, and steep enough, in aggregate, to be unmistakable. 7.9 million viewers in Season 4. By Season 13, 5.86 million. By Season 20, just 1.31 million. With a 0.45 rating in the adult demographic that advertisers care most about. By Season 23, 723,000 viewers. Less than 750,000 people watching new episodes of a show that once had nearly 8 million. That is a loss of approximately 90% of the show's viewership over the course of the revival seasons. No individual season's decline was catastrophic. Each could be explained by changing television habits, streaming competition, the decline of live broadcast viewing generally, the movement of young adult audiences away from appointment television. All of those explanations are real, and all of them apply. But they do not fully account for the gap. Other Fox animated shows experienced some of these same pressures and did not lose 90% of their audience. The show's own historical performance, its ability to build and maintain an audience against significant competitive headwinds in its early years, suggests that when an audience genuinely wants a show, external pressures do not fully explain their leaving. The audience left because the show gave them less reason to stay than it once had. The network's responses to these numbers tell the same story through institutional, rather than individual behavior. Moving the show from the Sunday animation domination block, where it had been a fixture for years, where it was the fellow traveler of The Simpsons, in the most prestigious animation real estate on American broadcast television, to Wednesday nights, is not a lateral move. It is a demotion. It says, we no longer consider this a headliner. We no longer build a night around it. We are placing it somewhere quieter, where expectations are lower and the audience is smaller. And we are doing this not because the show has changed, but because our assessment of what it deserves has changed. The April 2025 renewal deal, extending the show through 2028 or 2029, was celebrated as a vote of confidence and should also be understood as a business decision about licensing and streaming revenue that has very little to do with the quality of the episodes being produced. An animated show with 25 years of catalog is worth an enormous amount as a streaming library asset, independent of whether new episodes are good. The deal was made by a company that knows how to calculate the value of legacy content, and the value of Family Guy's legacy content is substantial regardless of what is happening in the new episodes. The show will run until the contractual end of its current deal because the money works, not because anyone at the network woke up excited about what the show was doing creatively. Final thoughts. The Iceberg as love letter. Everything in this video, from the surface facts to the deepest theories, has been constructed in a spirit that I want to name before we close out, because I think it matters to understand what this kind of analysis is for. The Iceberg is not a criticism. Not primarily. Every piece of content here, the theories, the hidden details, the production history, the uncomfortable readings exists because the show generated it. The purgatory theory, the simulation theory, the Peter's dream theory, the Brian as author theory, the reading of Meg as the show's most honest character. None of these could exist if the show had not created something worth spending that kind of analytical attention on. You do not build icebergs around things that do not matter. You build them around things that were significant enough to generate a community of people willing to go this deep. Family Guy, at its best seasons, 1 through 3. With their warmth and their specific intelligence and their genuine human heart, underneath all the absurdist comedy, was a show that earned this kind of attention. It earned it by being more than it seemed to be, by hiding genuine things inside the jokes, by trusting the audience to find them, by building characters who contained real emotional truth beneath their cartoon exteriors. The Iceberg is the record of those genuine things. The Iceberg is what 25 years of people paying attention to this show actually produces. And that it exists at all is evidence of what the show was, even when the show has stopped being it. That is what I want you to carry away from this. Not the darkness in the theories or the disappointment in the decline, but the fact that the theories are possible. That the decline is worth documenting. That a comedy show about a cartoon family in a fictional Rhode Island town generated enough depth and enough genuine feeling and enough people that there is an iceberg to explore. That is the highest compliment you can pay a piece of entertainment. Not that it was always good, that it was real enough to be worth this much attention for this long. Thank you for watching. If this resonated with you, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I will see you at the next one. The Cutaway Gag as Philosophy. What the format actually does. There is a serious argument to be made that the cutaway gag is not simply a comedy technique. It is a philosophy of attention, a specific claim about how comedy relates to reality, and the way the show used it in its best years versus its worst years illustrates the difference between a technique employed with intention and a technique deployed as a reflex. In its earliest and most precise form, the Family Guy cutaway works like this. A character makes a claim or reference, usually of the "this is worse than the time when Variety," and the show immediately illustrates that claim or reference. The cutaway is not random. It is calibrated to the specific reference that just occurred. The humor depends on the connection between the statement that set it up and the material that demonstrates it. And when that connection is well constructed, the result is a joke that has two layers. The surface layer of the cutaway content itself, and the deeper layer of what the cutaway's content reveals about the character who triggered it. What Peter chooses as his comparison reveals something about Peter. What Brian chooses reveals something about Brian. The cutaway is, in the best cases, character work disguised as non sequitur. The deterioration of this technique across the show's later seasons is tracked most accurately, not by counting the number of cutaways or measuring their length, though both of those metrics worsened significantly, but by observing the connection between setup and content. In the later seasons, the connection frequently becomes purely formal. A character says the setup line, the cutaway occurs, and the content bears no meaningful relationship to who the character is or what the setup line implied about them. The cutaway is triggered by the format requirement, not by the narrative logic of the character making the reference. The technique has become automatic. The thought that animated it is gone. The Conway Twitty gag is the most notorious extreme case of this, and it deserves a full accounting, rather than the brief mention it typically receives. In multiple episodes across several seasons, the show's response to a comedic situation is to simply cut to a full, uninterrupted performance of a Conway Twitty song. Not a clip, not a fragment. A full performance. The joke, if there is one, is the audacity of replacing the expected comedy with several minutes of vintage country music. The audience is sitting with Conway Twitty singing, waiting for the punchline that will never arrive, because the extended non-punchline is the punchline. The first time this happens, there is a kind of genuine surprise to it that could pass for humor. The sheer unexpectedness of the choice, the total commitment to the bit, the fact that the show is apparently willing to spend significant airtime on something that has no connection to anything, generates a reaction. The fourth time it happens, the reaction is entirely different. By the fourth Conway Twitty sequence, the joke has fully revealed itself as an absence of joke, as the show making an argument that it does not need to deliver what it promised, that the audience will sit with whatever the show provides, because the show has earned sufficient loyalty. The Conway Twitty gag is not the worst joke in Family Guy's history. It is the show explicitly stating that it does not believe it needs to make jokes anymore. That presence is sufficient. That the format persisting is enough. This is what the fan community means when they describe the show's later seasons as lazy, and it is worth being specific about what laziness looks like in creative work. Laziness in creative work is not the absence of effort. The Conway Twitty sequences took effort to clear the licensing rights, to edit, to place in the episode. Laziness in creative work is the replacement of thought with habit, the substitution of the form of a thing for its content. The form of a cutaway is present in every Conway Twitty sequence. The content, the actual thought that a cutaway is supposed to embody, is absent. What remains is the shell, going through the motions of the technique, while the intention that gave the technique its power has quietly departed. The South Park critique of Family Guy, delivered in the two-part Cartoon Wars episode from 2006, was both a genuine artistic argument and an act of competitive aggression, and both of those things can be true simultaneously. Trey Parker and Matt Stone depicted Family Guy's writing process as manatees randomly combining idea balls, the implication being that the show's comedy was the result of random association rather than genuine creative thought, that the connections between setup and cutaway were arbitrary rather than considered, and that you could replace any given Family Guy cutaway with any other and nothing of significance would be lost. This is an overstatement, particularly of the show as it existed in 2006. The early season's cutaways were not arbitrary, they were, as described above, calibrated to their setups in ways that required genuine creative thought. But Parker and Stone were making an argument about trajectory rather than current state. And their prediction that the randomness would accelerate as the show continued was accurate. By the time you reach the show's most criticized seasons, the manatee criticism has become genuinely difficult to rebut. Not because the writers are randomly assembling idea balls, but because the result looks the same as if they were. The fact that the show has made jokes about its own cutaway dependency, that it has broken the fourth wall to acknowledge the critiques that have been leveled against it, is one of the more philosophically interesting things about it. A show that knows it has a problem and jokes about having a problem is not the same as a show that has fixed the problem. But it is also not the same as a show that does not know. The self-awareness is real. The question is what to do with self-awareness that does not produce change. And the most honest answer is probably that self-awareness is not sufficient by itself. You can know exactly what is wrong with yourself and be completely unable to fix it. The knowing and the fixing are different operations, and the show has always been much better at the knowing. The legacy. What the show actually left behind. Whatever you think about Family Guy's later seasons, however frustrated you are with what it became, however much you mourn what it was in its first 3 years, the question of what the show actually left behind is worth answering carefully rather than sentimentally. Family Guy changed what animated comedy was allowed to do on American broadcast television. Before it, the ceiling of adult animation on broadcast was The Simpsons, which demonstrated that animated shows could engage with real social and cultural material with genuine intelligence. Family Guy took that permission and extended it specifically into territory that The Simpsons had identified but not fully occupied. The territory where comedy becomes uncomfortable, where the humor and the horror are not separated by much, where the show refuses to provide the emotional reassurance that most entertainment is built to deliver. The show's influence on the format of online comedy culture is genuine and significant and almost never fully credited. The cutaway gag, whatever its problems when applied badly, was one of the templates for the clip-based, non-sequential comedy culture that developed on the internet in the early 2000s, and that still defines how comedy content circulates today. The Family Guy clip that was shareable independent of its episode context, that could be understood without knowing who these characters were or what was happening in the larger story, was one of the earliest examples of entertainment content designed consciously or not for a distribution format that did not yet fully exist. YouTube launched in 2005. Family Guy was built for YouTube before YouTube existed. The show also produced, in its best moments, episodes that belong in any serious consideration of the finest things American animated television has produced. The Brian and Stewie Vault episode, Road to the Multiverse. The Stewie Kills Lois two-parter, Partial terms of endearment, banned in America, and worth watching for how much it refuses to take the easy road. The episodes are there. They exist. They are accessible. Whatever the show became in the years around them, those specific episodes represent a creative achievement that is worth knowing about. And the characters themselves, in their original forms, are worth preserving in the cultural memory as distinctly original creations. Not Peter in his later cruelty, but Peter in his early warmth, the lovable fool who meant well and felt bad when he hurt people. Not Brian in his later arrogance, but Brian in his early grounded intelligence, the smart dog, who was also a loyal friend, and knew the difference between the two. Not Stewie in his later gentleness, but the early Stewie, the evil genius baby, one of the most singular character concepts in the history of animation, a figure who was both terrifying and hilarious, and who the show eventually replaced because it ran out of ideas for something genuinely irreplaceable. These characters, in their original forms, were worth the attention this iceberg has given them. They earned it. They built it. And the iceberg is, in the end, built in their honor.